The monster that lived in this treasure room extended its huge paw towards the body lying on the ground, and the only one who could still stand on his feet watched the monster straighten up, continuing to clutch a small knife and shield in his hands. Having absolutely no idea what to do next in this situation, Nigel thought that he was a completely unlucky person to find himself facing a monster of such a level alone. After all, according to the information system data, the guy had only a 0 level and exactly the same completely absent percentage of mana, while the monster had a level much higher than 100. Behind the guy's back lay all those with whom he decided to go to this place in order to earn a little money to pay off the debt. At some point, the thought occurred to the guy that here he had every chance of dying. However, a moment later Nigel realized with full responsibility that he would definitely remain in this place forever, saying goodbye to life. In this regard, he definitely had nothing to lose, and the young man made the only decision possible for himself in such a situation. Jumping up from his seat, the young man rushed straight towards the huge monster, which, noticing the movement of the uninvited guest, had already extended its hand towards him. Some time ago, serious changes occurred in the lives of Earthlings when gates suddenly appeared, connecting the Earth with other worlds. Along with this, talented people appeared who entered these gates, destroying everything that they encountered on their way, receiving money and priceless artifacts, thereby receiving the title of real heroes. The whole world knew these heroes as monster hunters who instantly became very popular and in demand. But there remained on Earth those who were deprived of talent and therefore dragged out the most miserable existence. Once again digging through the pile of waste, Nigel first examined the remains of the medicine for hunters that he had found, and then a ring without any properties, where for these 2 items he could get about $30. Being one of those who was deprived of the talent of a hunter, the guy noticed that today was not his best day at this garbage dump. Throwing the bag with what he had found over his back, he headed to the point of sale, hoping to get at least some money to live for a few more days. The young man asked for forgiveness for someone he accidentally bumped into while walking, thinking about his miserable existence. Well, the one he hit immediately turned around, trying to get a good look at the guy, and suddenly the man grabbed him by the shoulder, noting that he had not even expected such a successful meeting. Nigel also recognized those who had been bothering him for a long time, realizing that now he might have more problems. Deciding to try to retreat, he said that he didn't have time to talk now, and began to move on. But a moment later, his modest prey had migrated into the hands of the hooligan, while his other comrade held the guy back. Feeling a simmering sensation inside him, Nigel sternly declared that it would be better for men not to anger him until he became truly angry, and made them regret their actions. And as soon as he finished speaking, he immediately received a strong blow, which was accompanied by the statement that Nigel had definitely lost the last of his brains. A man in glasses appeared at some point nearby, watching the guy being beaten, and suddenly ordered his fighters to stop so as not to accidentally kill him. After all, if this guy dies here now, there will be no one to repay the debt. He then turned to Nigel, asking him if he remembered how his father died. This question had a strong effect on the guy, and a picture of the past immediately began to form before his eyes, in which at some point he discovered his father's body dangling from a noose. Well, the man continued, telling them that his father had borrowed money from them because he hoped to make his son an excellent hunter. Nigel could hardly contain his emotions, as the man in glasses began to talk about the unspoken rules that parents' debts were to be paid by their children. And then he said that the guy's father died because of the guy himself, who was born a real scumbag from the start. Nigel could hold back no longer and was on his feet, hurling curses at the angry man and grabbing him by the clothes. When the guy's fist connected with the extortionist boss's face and his glasses flew to the side, the man, who didn't even bat an eyelid, asked if Nigel even understood what he was doing. But the young man didn't have time to respond to this, as he received a powerful blow from one of the boss's escorts. As he fell, the man grinned, noting that the guy needed to be more careful, otherwise, because of such thoughtless actions, one of his fighters could simply kill the guy. He then approached the prone Nigel and reminded him that at level 0, he would never be able to deal any damage to him. After all, Stan himself was already level 20, and the class he belonged to was warriors. Still lying on the ground with his level 0 and undefined class, Nigel could only demand that his interlocutor shut his mouth. Well, he once again noted that he was talking and dealing with real scum and nothing more. The man was very surprised when Nigel suddenly announced that he would pay off his father's debts, where Stan did not really believe that collecting from garbage dumps would allow the guy to pay off even a tenth of the debt before the end of his life. Feeling the boot of the extortionist boss on his face, the young man asked to give him a month to pay, and if he did not repay the debt, he would be ready to pay with his internal organs. But then he added that if he succeeded, Stan would have to kneel at his father's grave and ask for forgiveness. Smiling and believing in his victory, the man accepted the agreement proposed by the guy. Then he clarified that taking into account all the accrued interest, the guy must return 70 million to him within a month. As he was leaving, he dropped a last remark that he had heard about a recruitment drive for a foray into another world, where even such scum as Nigel were accepted. The young man had no choice, since collecting 70 million by digging through garbage dumps was definitely not possible, and so he headed to the center for recruiting groups for forays. Approaching one of the tables, he declared that he wanted to take part in a sortie against the monsters, where the only question that interested him was how much he could make from it. The man talking to him noted that those who survive will receive 1 million each. The families of the dead will be paid 500,000, but those who escape will receive nothing. This seemed like very encouraging news to the guy, where in order to pay off the debt, he only needed to go to other worlds 70 times. Noticing from the guy's face how inspired he was, the group leader announced to him that he had been accepted into the team. And this statement made Nigel even happier, since until the very end, he did not believe that someone with a 0 level could be needed. As the guy walked away, a masked man standing next to the group's leader asked why they needed such a weakling, and Mac explained that guys like this guy were the perfect cover for the main part of the group. Nigel himself did not yet understand for what purposes they were going to use him, having so easily accepted him into the team. After all, Mac specifically recruited weaklings to use as human shields and distractions for the monsters. The group was assembled quite quickly, and soon its full complement was at the gate. Stepping forward, Mac made an announcement, saying that several new members had joined his group today. He separately noted the participation of 3 temporary members of the group in this sortie. Listening to the man, Nigel noticed to himself that he was not even considered a part of the main group, being called a temporary member. Well, Mac expressed his hope that everyone would be able to get along with each other, and that anyone who would violate the order would be left without payments. However, this statement was not accepted by everyone, where experienced hunters immediately declared that temporary newcomers were not their equal. At some point, Nigel's attention was drawn to a female voice coming from the side. Approaching the guy, the girl asked if he knew how to use the auxiliary system, and when the young man asked what kind of system this was, his interlocutor, reaching out to his head, said that this system gives some advantages to hunters. And so the girl activated the auxiliary system she had named so that the guy could use it. He was incredibly surprised when he received information about his level and his pitifully low stats. But Mina, who was standing next to him, exhaled heavily and concluded that Nigel was an incredible weakling, had level 22, and also belonged to the healer class. Leaving him, she recommended the guy to work hard in order to achieve some more significant results. Mac continued, announcing that after entering, the temporary members of the group would go first, followed by the newcomers, and everyone else would bring up the rear. When the man finished, he asked the appropriate question, once again making sure that everyone had heard and understood him. The introduction and briefing were over, and now the 3 temporary members of the group decided to chat a little among themselves. The eldest of them noted that he would never back down, since he had 2 daughters who really needed the money. Another guy with glasses also said that his wife's illness brought him here. Well, Nigel didn't explain anything, simply saying that he decided to take part in the foray for the first time for the sake of money for personal needs. As they moved closer to the passage, the temporary members of the hunting group wished each other luck, urging each other to survive at all costs. When everyone was ready, the gates to another world opened, letting the hunters in. The leader of the group gave a command, after which everyone headed to another world in order to become rich or die. As Nigel took each step, all he could think about was that at the end of this test, a whole million was waiting for him. As agreed, the temporary members of the hunting group were the first to move through the stone tunnel. The great hunters themselves walked deep in the rear, only talking about how it was time for some monsters to appear and amuse them. Turning to Nigel, the oldest of the temporary participants noted that it had become much cooler. Also feeling the change in temperature, the young man called on everyone to stop, pointing a light in front of him. And when the wall was illuminated, he discovered an incredibly large hole in it. Apparently, this was the lair of the monsters living here, which made another temporary member of the group's knees shake. These monsters turned out to be small cave spiders that were only level 3. Noticing that his pioneers had stopped, Mac reminded them that he wasn't paying for talking, demanding that they continue moving forward and ignore these little spiders. While his comrades were discussing the fact that there really was no danger, Nigel suddenly noticed some huge approaching shadow. The oldest of them decided to go first to check how their path would go further. But before he could take a single step, some force suddenly tore his body from the cave floor, and Nigel could already clearly distinguish each limb of the huge spider hanging from the ceiling of the cave, which killed the first temporary member of the group. But as it turned out, this spider was not the only dangerous creature in this place. Noticing the monsters, Mac gave the order not to panic and for everyone to prepare for the upcoming battle. Inside, he knew he was facing a serious threat, so his backup plan was to distract the spider's attention to the temporary participants so he could escape. His thoughts were interrupted by Mina, who informed the group leader that there was more than one high-level spider here. And indeed, the group was literally surrounded on all sides by very high-level mutated insects. The fat man, one of the temporary members, had already managed to panic, begging the group leader to save his life. Meanwhile, Mac had already begun to destroy the spiders, striking them with his impressively sized hammer. At one point, he answered the fat man that he could not protect him, as he was busy destroying another monster. Nigel understood that from that moment on, all temporary participants were left entirely to their own devices. He didn't even have time to notice how one of the monsters attacking the group appeared right in front of his face. It took incredible effort for the young man to dodge the spider's blow, which left him without a lighting device. But the monster did not stop there, continuing to advance on the guy who had just miraculously escaped death. Not knowing what to do next, the young man literally froze in place, watching the inevitable death approach. He was brought out of his stupor by Mina's words that he should stop daydreaming and use the system he had received. The girl explained that with the help of this system, he can materialize weapons and protective items for himself. But at some point, Mac ordered her to ignore this monster food and continue doing her job. Nigel tried to wrap his head around everything the girl had told him. The spider was already very close when the young man decided that he had to do something. The monster's paw was already flying at him when he ordered the system to give him at least some protection. And with the help of the shield that materialized in his hand, the young man was able to avoid the fatal blow. Knowing full well that he needed to survive at all costs, Nigel began to materialize a weapon in his other hand, with which he struck the advancing spider, putting all the strength he had into it. But his amazement knew no bounds when the system showed that with this blow, he was able to take away only a little bit from the spider's health. Under such circumstances, the guy understood that any resistance on his part was absolutely useless. It seemed that after the blow received, the monster simply became even more enraged. Watching him approach, Nigel was well aware that this time he would be able to do absolutely nothing. But then the spider was brought down by a powerful blow from the group's leader, who happily noted that this was the last one. After which the man also noted that he did not even expect such agility from a temporary participant. Other hunters also noted that the guy certainly has plenty of courage. The young man himself still could not believe that he had just managed to survive. At the same time, the masked hunter approached the second temporary participant, demanding that he rise to his feet while he continued to beg for salvation. Calling the fat man a loser, the masked man remarked that they would all make good money. While in the background, another hunter rejoiced at receiving a valuable item. Having familiarized himself with the characteristics of the dagger, Nigel noted to himself that it would be nice to get such a professional weapon for himself. Noticing the guy's gaze focused on the dagger, Mac remarked that he must be jealous of their team getting so many valuables. After which he added that Nigel could also receive such a weapon if he lived until the end of the sortie. And so Mac announced that the group's advance was continuing, with the temporary members of the group once again to move first. Nigel, before continuing on, cast a quick glance at his less courageous comrade, who continued to shake with fear. After studying the map, Mac noticed that there was apparently no dominant monster in this place, but a treasure trove was marked. And now he was already announcing that, in the case of great luck, the group could well count on discovering artifacts there. This announcement made all the permanent members of Mac's group incredibly happy. Nigel knew that the chance of getting an artifact during a raid was only about 0.5%. But if you were lucky, the hunter received incredibly valuable items, weapons, and equipment. After his statement about the possibility of finding artifacts, the man turned to Nigel, reminding him that he had high hopes for the guy. But the young man already knew that they were simply being used as bait and human shields. The movement continued, and soon the guy in the mask, noticing a strong glow, called the leader of the group, showing him a room that was literally completely filled with gold coins. As soon as Max saw this incredible amount of gold, he instantly concluded that they were now fabulously rich. All the other hunters were already starting to make plans for their entire future, carefree and prosperous life. Someone even suggested that it was just an illusion, but when the coins were in their hands, there was no longer any doubt about the reality of what was happening. Mina, upon seeing the treasure, happily declared that now she could simply go on vacation and not engage in forays. The only one who was tense was Nigel, who was convinced that this was the room where the main monster usually lived. The young man did not understand at all why none of the hunters even thought about possible hidden traps. And while the guy was looking around, the fat man standing behind him was happy that now they too would get rich. But Nigel seemed not to hear his words, turning his attention to the huge stone statue located in the middle of the treasury. He was the first to notice how the stone statue began to shake and crack. At that very second, the guy shouted that something was wrong here, and that the group should leave as soon as possible. The masked guy, who hadn't noticed anything yet, responded that he wasn't going to throw such a pile of gold here. These were his last words, after which the revived giant literally turned him into a pancake with one of his limbs. A loud noise made the leader of the group turn around and look in horror at what was happening right next to him, where he and all the other members of the group saw how the statue standing in the middle of the room came to life. And this monster was ready to destroy all uninvited guests who had their eye on his treasure. Quickly getting his bearings and declaring that it was the dominant monster, Mac ordered everyone to prepare for battle. And so the hunters activated their abilities to confront the threat and destroy the monster. Using his magic staff, one of the hunters dealt a fiery blow to the enemy. Following him, Mac used the energy of his hammer, preparing to continue the attack, where he was able to reach the enemy, delivering an incredibly powerful blow to his lower limb. Here, a third hunter, who possessed non-trivial speed qualities, joined the confrontation. Deciding that his comrades had managed to inflict good damage on the monster, he quickly moved towards it in order to behead it. But the monster saw all his movements perfectly well and prepared for a counterattack, where such became a dense beam of light, which he directed straight at the approaching hunter. Mac couldn't believe that another one of his comrades had been destroyed in literally a second. Suddenly, behind him, he heard Mina's voice, who first quietly said that they couldn't. The girl had already managed to use her system, having studied the characteristics of the monster, and realized that none of those present could cope with it. After all, this was a monster that had a level of over 100, and which belonged to one of the highest ranks. The hunter with the staff emitting fire wanted to say something about their enemy, but the sound of his speech was abruptly interrupted. After all, the monster that was in charge here grabbed him in his huge hand. The fat man, having seen how the third hunter, a fat man from among the temporary participants, died, again fell into a panic. Soon Nigel saw the body of the leader of this group fly past him, which landed right on the fleeing fat man, smashing him right into the floor of the cave. Nigel stood and watched as everyone he had come here with died one by one. And then Mac, who was still breathing, begged Nigel to take him out of here, since he didn't want to die at all, and offered a whole bunch of money for his life. And so the young man stood in this treasury one-on-one with a huge monster, against which all the hunters of this group were powerless. He couldn't even imagine how he could do anything against this monster. The guy came to the conclusion that he would definitely die in this cave today. Deciding that any action was better than any inaction, Nigel rushed at the opponent standing opposite him. But the monster was not idle either, meeting the last surviving member of the group that had come here, who was rushing towards him with his huge hand. The blow that the young man received had truly incredible force. Losing touch with reality, Nigel still continued to feel his body flying, cutting through the air. The force of the blow threw him to the side of the room, where there was something that the group members had not yet noticed when they entered the treasury. The last thing the guy noticed in his life was some kind of stone sculpture depicting a beautiful girl. After this, his body was impaled on a protruding spike, and his blood was sprinkled on the head of the girl's statue. Nigel's vision grew darker and darker as he tried to comprehend the fact that something had literally pierced his body. After being plunged into complete darkness, the young man suddenly felt as if his body was sinking into some depth. But at some point the guy felt a touch to his hair, after which he heard a female voice demanding that he wake up. When he opened his eyes, he saw a girl in front of him who stated that she had been sleeping for a very long time, and did not expect at all that someone would be able to wake her up. The appearance of this strange person, like all her words, was still a completely incomprehensible phenomenon for Nigel. Shaking his head several times, he was convinced that the girl in front of him was absolutely real. After looking at Nigel, who had regained consciousness, for a while, his interlocutor suddenly asked if he would like to receive a little power as a gift. And while the guy was surprised that the girl was flying through the air, she said that fate had chosen him despite the fact that he was incredibly weak. At some point, Nigel suddenly remembered that he actually died after being pierced through. And while he was feeling his body in search of a wound, his new acquaintance explained that she had patched him up a little in honor of their first meeting. Not believing that this was even possible, the young man asked her who she was. Introducing herself as Regina, the girl said that she was now nothing less than a deity for Nigel. Spreading a deck of cards in front of the guy, Regina explained that she had been locked here for several long centuries. But the young man, who was looking closely at each card, somehow managed to free it. In connection with this, the girl expressed her strong desire to somehow thank the guy. Laying the entire deck in front of him, Regina added that today, Nigel was receiving the blessing of the god of fate himself. When the deck was collected, the goddess explained that each card had its own power, suggesting that the guy draw one. Hesitant to take the required action, Nigel wondered how many cards he could draw at once, and whether it was even possible. Well, the beautiful Regina added that in any case, she is now the mistress of the one to whom she rewards with power. But the girl's face changed dramatically when she noticed what the guy was about to do. Using a completely unconventional approach, the young man suddenly grabbed the entire deck, declaring that he was choosing all the cards. After this action, his consciousness and he himself began to return to the very room where his life had recently ended, where a huge monster continued to roam the treasury, having destroyed all the members of the group. Returning to the world of the living, the young man suddenly saw only one card in front of him. But on this one card was depicted the very girl who offered to give him power, where Regina herself could not believe that after the guy chose the entire deck, she turned into his servant, and not vice versa. Meanwhile, the young man's body had already managed to return to full normal, leaving the place where it had been thrown by the monster's blow. Taking this single card in his hands, Nigel immediately heard Regina's voice, who continued to be indignant about what was happening. When the guy asked, she angrily explained that since he took all the cards at once, they merged into one, becoming one force. Noticing the approach of the monster, the girl stopped explaining, ordering the guy to draw some card as quickly as possible. But he didn't understand how, because in front of him there was only one card, which suddenly began to glow. He got the answer to his question when that single card suddenly multiplied. Meanwhile, the monster was preparing for a new attack, and then Regina began to rush the young man. Shouting as loudly as she could, she demanded that he choose a card immediately. And when he finally made his choice, the goddess activated her abilities, calling upon the one who was on the map, where this character turned out to be a certain goddess of war, who is a mythical creature. The young man was literally shocked when the card in front of him suddenly turned into a real person, whose image he saw on it. Nigel couldn't believe that the very same mythical goddess of war was standing in front of him now, who meanwhile had already managed to rush forward, heading towards the monster's energy strike, which she was able to block quite easily with her wings. The young man watched, fascinated, every action of the goddess who appeared from the card. Realizing that he was losing, the monster changed strategy, releasing a huge number of previously hidden limbs in the form of long tentacles. He tried to neutralize the girl floating in the air with strikes from his tentacles, but she deftly dodged each strike. At some point, the girl stopped dodging, revealing the weapon she had with her, which she directed together with her body towards the most vulnerable spot of the monster opposing her. She literally passed through the body of her bulky opponent, and this was enough for the fight to end in her favor, and with a complete unconditional victory for the girl. The winner herself, smiling sweetly, once again became the most ordinary card that she had been before, where an astonished Nigel watched her reverse transformation without taking his eyes off it. After that, he received a system message congratulating him on his victory. With this, the clearing of this world was complete, and the doors through which the group entered here opened again. Watching the opening passage, the young man became immersed in some of his own thoughts, where, with his thoughtfulness, he was able to provoke Regina's interest in the subject of such. In response to the question, the young man said that he did not understand why the girl did not use this door to exit, but she only laughed in response to what her interlocutor said. But then Regina seemed to go berserk, reminding the guy that it was he who took the entire deck at once, thereby tying it to him. The girl also noted that Nigel was guilty of destroying her sculpture, which happened during the battle. She then explained that at this stage the young man was not able to control the full power of the cards, and in the battle that had taken place he had used only part of it. After listening to his interlocutor, Nigel suddenly announced that he had completely forgotten about something. He told the clearly offended girl that he simply wanted to thank her for saving his life. After all, if it weren't for Regina, he would have ended up today just like all the other members of the group. Without any enthusiasm, his interlocutor said that there was no need to thank her, because it was thanks to the guy that she woke up from her eternal sleep. Then she greatly surprised the young man, who still had many questions, when she announced that it was time for her to rest a little. He tried to stop his interlocutor, but she had already literally disappeared into thin air. Nigel then wondered how he could get his money back given that the group's leader was dead. Lost in his thoughts, the young man did not notice how someone else appeared next to him. His attention was drawn to the sudden flashes of light and a voice calling out to the hunter. The young man then turned around to find himself surrounded by armed men, the leader of which declared that the master hunter would have to go with them. The system immediately showed Nigel all the characteristics of the man who reported the detection and capture of the target. Still hoping for a better outcome, Nigel tried to explain that he was not who he was taken for. Sitting in the office in handcuffs, the young man once again declared that he would not give a different answer, no matter how many times he was asked about it. The guy stated with full responsibility that he was an ordinary civilian who ended up in that place completely by accident. These words of the guy brought the one who detained him into a real rage, causing him to jump forward from his seat and grab the guy from the chair. Filled with rage, the man said that he clearly saw Nigel coming out of the gate leading to another world. But the young man continued to insist on his own, saying that he was simply passing by this place and did not leave it. At that moment, a girl entered the room and asked for forgiveness for interrupting an important interrogation. She rather cheerfully stated that, according to the results of the check, the detainee was very weak, and therefore did not have a single chance to survive in that world, not to mention defeating the dominant monster. After these words, Nigel's interrogator looked at the guy for a few more seconds. And now, finally, he realized what he had heard from Gina, and threw it aside from himself. After the handcuffs were removed, the girl apologized to the young man on behalf of the office for wasting his time. Then the girl explained to the young man where he could pick up his documents. Glad that everything ended so easily, Nigel headed for the exit, saying goodbye to the girl. Watching him go, the man asked if there was any point in letting him go, and Gina replied that they still couldn't find an explanation for how he was able to clear out that cave. After all, judging by his characteristics, he should have been one of the first in the group to die. Nigel breathed an even greater sigh of relief when he found himself outside. He was incredibly happy that he could see the sunlight again and not be left to rot in a prison cell. And suddenly he heard a familiar voice declaring that in a little while she would have to save him again. Looking at Regina, the young man asked her why she was here, and she answered him rather rudely, explaining that since her strength was with the guy, then she would always be there. Then the young man turned around and looked at the sign of the building he had just left. He noted that the elite of all hunters lived inside, where they controlled how the raids were carried out. Noting that she was completely indifferent to it, Regina asked the guy what he intended to do next, and the young man explained that he had two important matters, one of which could be called the return of a debt, and the other retribution. Stan cheerfully stated that he had not even expected to meet Nigel again so quickly, and when he handed the man the blue stone, saying that he was lucky to receive it from one of the monsters, he reported that the guy's debt was paid in full. After these words, the young man suddenly declared that in that case, Stan now had to do something for him. Raising his head, the man asked how he could help such a good client. He received an immediate response, where Nigel demanded that he kneel down immediately. After such a statement, the shocked henchman looked at the boss in confusion, who angrily noted that the guy had clearly come here to find his death, and now he had already given the order to kill the impudent fellow, which one of his henchmen named Todd rushed to carry out immediately. But Nigel already had one of the cards ready. The big guy in the mask couldn't even get close to the guy who was noticing that it was now his turn to collect the debts. Showing one of his cards, he explained that he had just used a special shield that would shock anyone who dared to attack it. Shocked Stan couldn't believe his eyes, confusedly asking what kind of cards his former debtor had. Meanwhile, all the other henchmen of the man rushed towards the side where Nigel stood, intending to finish what Todd had failed to do. But the young man had no intention of giving up or losing today, starting to move and preparing a new card. Dodging the blows, he activated the second card he had prepared earlier, which turned out to be a very useful attack skill in this situation, the Sandfist Strike. When the card's effects began to manifest on a physical level, it left the extortionist boss even more shocked. After all, a huge sandfist suddenly appeared out of thin air in the room, sweeping away everyone in its path. Thrown into the air, the man hysterically demanded that someone explain to him what was going on here. When the action of the second card was over, the young man repeated his demand for the boss to kneel, or otherwise he would not vouch for anything that would happen next. The man, lying on the floor and badly bruised after the action of the sandfist, asked Nigel about the cards that had appeared at his disposal. After all, this was a completely non-trivial skill, where he had never seen anything like it in any hunter, and therefore Stan was also interested in what class his interlocutor had. Smiling, the young man simply stated that he himself did not know. After all, any card he drew endowed him with the power that was indicated on it. After these words, he looked at the new card he had drawn, which showed a certain thunderclap, which he decided to test on his former creditor, to the great horror of the latter. Before the powerful explosion, the man managed to scream a plea for mercy, but the guy remained adamant until the very end. Regina couldn't tear her admiring gaze away from the food she saw in front of her. After all, the girl couldn't even imagine that people could have such great talent in cooking. Well, Nigel was quite surprised at how good his new acquaintance's appetite was, because he considered her some kind of astral form that would not be able to taste ordinary food. Then, changing the subject of the conversation, the young man told Regina that no matter how hard he tried, for some reason he had not been able to summon more than 3 cards lately. But for the girl, this was not at all surprising, and she explained that the guy uses her power to summon and use cards, which he then returns. Listening to the explanations, the young man was incredibly surprised, and a couple of seconds later he flew into a rage, threateningly declaring that he had taken a whole bunch of cards and should be able to use them all. Stopping this outburst of rage, Regina explained that he could use cards like the Immortal Goddess card, but only when the energy expended was restored. This was already something, and the young man asked his interlocutor about how much time he would need to restore his energy. Regina explained that he would have to wait until next week to use skills like the ones he used today. But the guy was completely broken morally when he heard that in order to use the card with the goddess, he needed a 2-year restoration of energy. His interlocutor continued, saying that if he wanted to recover faster, he needed to absorb the energy of killed monsters, and also adding that his 3 main cards were also good. And when Nigel noted that he definitely wouldn't be able to defeat monsters with these skills, Regina said that he simply hadn't seen his new card yet. Information about a certain new map greatly interested the young man. Then his interlocutor showed him what she was talking about, where on the map he saw a painfully familiar silhouette. It was the same monster that destroyed his entire team, with whom he first went on a cleanup. Regina explained that after a monster is destroyed, its energy is placed in a new card, which replenishes its skill treasury. After which the guy can either establish a permanent connection with the creature, or simply acquire and use some of its skills. When she finished, she expressed the main idea, which was whether Nigel would dare to go to battle with only 4 cards at his disposal. There was something to think about here. Because of these 4 cards, the one that had the energy of the monster he had defeated was the only attacking one. When his interlocutor asked him what bothered him, the young man replied that he was, of course, bothered by the limited resources and opportunities available. But he was able to surprise Regina when he suddenly, with one sharp movement, dropped his cards on the table, after which he stated with absolute confidence that these 4 cards would be enough for him to get through the monsters, and he suggested that his companion go and clean up the monsters from other worlds immediately. When Regina remarked that the place smelled like hundreds of leprechauns had died and were decomposing there, Nigel explained that it was the city sewer. At some point, the young man doubted that there could be a passage to another world here, but his companion measured that a strong magical flow was flowing here. Looking around, Nigel noticed that he did not see any flows, after which he received an explanation that he should not see hidden energy flows. Then the girl extended her small hand, noting that she would now activate her energy, after which the guy would receive the result. And as soon as she did this, a passage to another world, hidden from prying eyes, really appeared before Nigel. After a couple of seconds, silhouettes of those entering the portal began to appear on the other side of it. When the young man and his companion found themselves on the other side, the girl added that if Nigel felt that he could not cope, they could always quickly leave this place. But he, wondering what kind of world this was, had already noticed some movement to the side. The system and Regina suggested that this creature is a local water lizard, which is not dangerous one-on-one. But when a whole group attacks, defeating them becomes quite difficult. After this, the girl again suggested that the young man abandon the idea of cleaning up, but he was determined. While assessing the number of potential opponents, Nigel also worked on developing a battle strategy, where the main component of his plan was to destroy the lizards with the help of the card he had of the previously defeated monster, from which he received an extremely powerful blow, which that monster could use. According to Nigel's plan, he first had to attract the attention of all the lizards by making them really angry. When the lizards get angry and start chasing him, he will activate a card with a speed skill to escape, and then the monster's death blow will be activated, which will destroy all of its opponents at once. After listening to the guy, Regina found the plan he came up with to be very, very good for clearing out this place. The young man continued talking about how he would exterminate all the lizards at once, content with the praise from Regina, and not noticing how one of the lizards was examining the map in his hand from behind his back. At some point he felt someone's presence, and then the lizard made a short, frightening sound, and when the guy turned around, the monster immediately rushed at its new prey. Nigel had a hard time pulling in his stomach to keep part of himself from becoming the lizard's lunch. Panicking, he immediately activated his only card with an attack skill. Of course, this was quite enough to completely neutralize the enemy. Exhaling, the young man noted that he had such a powerful card at his disposal. But then he felt a powerful blow, which was accompanied by a comment from Regina that Nigel was completely out of his mind. After all, only a madman could use such a powerful skill just to kill some lizard. And now the guy was left without the only attacking skill he had at his disposal. After listening to the girl, the young man, showing her the card, noted that his skill had not disappeared at all, despite using it. But his mood instantly changed when Regina explained that the card would always be with him, and he simply used all of its energy. And since this card is just a blank until the energy is fully restored, Regina added that now is the time to think about future plans. After all, in just a few seconds the young man will have a whole bunch of problems. Nigel was about to ask what other problems there were when he heard a sound behind him and turned around. These were other lizards, who always lived in groups and now came to avenge their murdered relative. Realizing there was only one way out, Regina told Nigel to get ready to run when she opened the portal. But the young man responded with a categorical refusal, declaring that he would not run. Picking up the card with the lizard in his hand, the guy noted that this card was much better than the one that could only be used once, after which there was a long wait for recharging. However, according to the previous plan of action, the young man still had to run away from the lizards. Regina, who was always nearby, noted that the current state of affairs was completely unenviable. When she told the guy that he was about to be trapped, Nigel replied that you always have to have a backup plan. Noting that he had developed an excellent strategy, the young man pulled out one of his standard skill cards, where in this case it was the skill of slowing down everyone nearby. And so the action of this card was directed by the guy at the approaching lizards, whose speed of movement was reduced by approximately 100 times. Regina, however, did not share Nigel's positive attitude, saying that slowing down did not eliminate the threat completely. But the young man already had the card with the lizard ready, as well as the second of the cards with the main skills, preparing to combine their action. And then, right before the girl's eyes, an armored lizard appeared, which became the manifestation of another attack skill. Controlling the unusual pet, Nigel ordered the armored lizard to destroy his relatives, and the lizard, whose body was partially covered with stone protection, immediately rushed to carry out the master's order. However, as he watched what was happening, the joy began to disappear from the guy's face. After all, his pet moved just as slowly as all the enemies advancing on them. This made Nigel wonder why his lizard had also been affected by the slow card. To this, Regina explained that the slowdown works in a certain zone, and therefore affects everyone who enters it, even her own creatures. And when the guy noted that in this case the advantages of his lizard were not so great, the girl asked him whether he was really that stupid, or was just pretending, having forgotten about the presence of a card with a reverse effect. While keeping this skill for possible escape, the young man actually managed to forget about it. Taking out the acceleration card, the guy cheerfully noted that he would now speed up his lizard a little. And so, having received acceleration, the lizard, armored with stones, began to crush his opponents left and right. He moved with incredible speed, leaving no chance for any of his fellows. Well, his owner and Regina only had time to rejoice at receiving various items that helped in restoring energy. After this, the girl had no choice but to note that Nigel had come up with and implemented an excellent plan. The girl noticed to herself that everything that was happening was taking on a completely different appearance. After all, she was initially convinced that this guy was just a fool, mindlessly relying on luck, but he turned out to be able to competently and effectively combine the skills of the cards. And now she was very interested in what else this representative of the human race could come up with and implement. At some point, the slowdown card began to stop working in the area where the armored lizard was frolicking, which made the guy start to get nervous, because his pet hadn't yet managed to deal with all the opponents. Regina called him to calm down, recommending that he look around carefully, where all the lizards that remained alive looked very depressed and did not dare to continue the attack. And suddenly Nigel's armored lizard made a loud and prolonged growling sound, which was enough to put all remaining opponents to flight. Watching the fleeing lizards, the young man could not yet believe that he had managed to achieve victory, and more cards were already starting to fly into his hands, the number of which was quite impressive. Without taking his eyes off the young man, he watched as the cards fell into his hand. And when he had all the new cards, even his companion could not hide her surprise. After all, the winner had a whole bunch of new cards in his hand with lizards that his armored pet had defeated. But as it turned out, this was only the beginning of the action, as the cards suddenly began to fly out of the guy's hand, and they were directed straight at his stone lizard, dissolving in his body, which caused a bright glow. Nigel and his companion watched with their eyes fixed on the armored lizard's body as it absorbed the cards and transformed. And now the young man has already noted that the original form of this lizard no longer exists. Now in front of him was a completely different creature, which the armored lizard had transformed into after absorbing several cards. And in the hand of the owner of this monster, a new card immediately appeared, with the help of which he could always summon a pet. He was informed by a system message that his lizard had not only evolved, but had also gained regeneration skills and improved armor. All this time, Regina watched what was happening in silence, but at some point she began to smile. And now, the girl was literally bursting with laughter, provoking a question from Nigel about what could be funny about this. She then apologized, explaining that she simply lost her temper, and had not expected that someone could be capable of creating a new species through simple creativity. As they continued moving, the young man noted that his lizard's skills were good, but they were mostly defensive. Well, Regina started talking about the fact that since the guy is able to summon this lizard, then all his skills will be added to his body. All this made the young man literally clutch his head, as he did not understand how he could be connected with this lizard. Then his companion explained that even if he couldn't use all the skills, thanks to the characteristics of this lizard, Nigel himself would be harder to kill. Which made the young man wonder if he himself would turn into something like a lizard because of such a connection. Where this question caused Regina to burst into another fit of uncontrollable laughter. When she managed to calm down a little, the girl reminded her that initially all the guy's power was connected with her presence, where the decisive role is played by the connection between his and her souls, for which he should be immensely grateful to the goddess. At some point, Regina suggested to her interlocutor to postpone their conversation to another, more convenient time. After all, they had just reached their final destination. This was the furthest point in this world, the room where the main monster should be. After examining the stone sculpture of some kind of toad, the young man chuckled, asking if he should fight this thing. And Regina noted that for now it is just a statue, but the person hiding behind it does not have the ability to fight with people here. Nigel, however, decided to be more careful, since he had already been killed once by a creature that appeared from the stone. Turning to his companion, the young man asked her if she knew the man hiding under the stone, and Regina noted that she did not know of any other creature as ugly and shameless as this toad. Realizing that she knew exactly this god or spirit, the young man began to look around. Looking straight ahead, Nigel immediately noticed the heads of the lizards poking out of the water. From the appearance of the lizards, one could understand that they were still scared and wary of the new appearance of the armored individual, who had now become their alpha. Well, the young man kept his new map ready, preparing to use it in case the reptiles tried to hinder his movement. And suddenly Nigel heard some sounds that appeared behind him. He had not yet seen the huge monster that had appeared behind him, clutching an equally huge weapon in his hand. Having made up his mind, the young man began to turn around to at least assess the impending threat. Regina only had time to scream for the guy to dodge when the monster's axe landed right next to his feet. Looking first at the weapon and then at its owner, Nigel noticed that this monster was apparently the main monster here. Straightening up after the first attack, the monster seemed even larger in size than during the attack. Looking at him, the young man cheerfully noted that he did not understand any of the sounds the monster was making, but he could assume that it was extremely displeased. And now he had already prepared a card with his evolved lizard, addressing the enemy that he should think carefully about whether it was worth continuing the battle. The armored modified lizard literally burst out of the map and immediately rushed at its new opponent, trying to deal him a crushing blow with one of his clawed paws. Nigel immediately noticed that things were going to be very difficult when he saw how the leading monster grabbed his lizard by the attacking limb with its teeth. This was extremely unexpected for him, because it turned out that this monster literally anticipated his actions. In such a situation, the guy had no choice but to try to bring his lizard to a long distance, which was now difficult to implement. The observing Regina also noted that defeating this opponent would be a very difficult task. Turning to his companion, the young man asked her to explain how this monster differed from all the others. And the girl explained that this huge lizard is distinguished by its exceptional intelligence. Its highly developed intelligence distinguishes it favorably and significantly from any other lizards. Meanwhile, Nigel's airborne lizard decided to take action to free itself from capture, where the first thing he did was direct his free-clawed paw straight at the eye of his bulky opponent. And then, taking advantage of the sudden movement of the monster's head, the lizard got rid of its captured limb. Watching the blood fly in all directions, Nigel became very scared for his armored lizard. But he landed quite successfully right in front of his owner, although he was left without one of his upper limbs. Regina was very struck by the fact that the character from the card had his own consciousness, thanks to which he made an independent decision to sacrifice his hand in order to free himself. Well, the huge lizard, wounded in the eye, was chaotically waving its weapon, wanting to destroy the one who left it without an eye. By making threatening sounds, he seemed to be loudly declaring that he would immediately kill everyone who invaded his domain, where his roar was accompanied by the release of a colossal amount of powerful energy. Watching the actions of the dominant monster, the young man wondered what this battle roar was for, and his companion noticed that this was not just a roar, but the monster using its skill, where this skill was the manifestation of leadership among one's own kind. And after the release of energy was carried out, all the other lizards, who had been hiding in the water until then, began to crawl out, rushing towards the new alpha. Watching them approach, the young man noticed that they were in a real trap. But then Nigel's attention was drawn to Regina, who decided to even the odds a little, where the girl explained that the toad that is now locked in the stone has some power here. Looking at his interlocutor, the young man asked her to explain what she meant by this, and the girl added that now the interests of the guy and the creature locked in the stone could be similar, where, if the toad awakens, it will begin to act against this huge monster. Well, in order to free this creature, the young man simply needs to destroy its stone cage. At the same time, Regina also mentioned that just thinking about this toad makes her shake. Taking note of everything she had just said, Nigel prepared to act by pulling out one of the cards. He needed to focus on the toad statue, so he instructed his wounded lizard to continue holding off the leading monster. When his armored lizard made it clear that the task was clear, the boy gave the command to begin the attack. After which his lizard rushed towards his opponent, leaving the owner alone with the approaching monsters. But Nigel was not at all afraid of the lizards moving towards him, where he had already prepared an acceleration map. Noticing that the young man was starting to move towards the toad statue, the leading monster ordered the lizards to stop him at all costs. But it was unlikely that the lizards would be able to stop the guy who was rushing towards his goal at incredible speed. Then the leading monster decided to try to interrupt his advancement on his own. But he was unable to move forward, as Nigel's lizard was in his way, who jumped high up and dealt his opponent a powerful blow with his lower limb straight to the lower jaw. After which he made it clear to the monster that he would now smear him across the stone floor. But his opponent responded by making it clear that he would destroy his opponent much faster. After which the armored lizard jumped high again, dodging the sweeping movements of his opponent. He quickly approached the monster's head, thinking that he would not allow this monster to get close to its owner. And so the huge monster experienced a new application of force from the armored lizard on its head. The monster tried to reach the enemy with blows of the axe, but the lizard deftly dodged each attack, which drove his opponent into extreme rage, causing him to swing his axe with renewed vigor. But Nigel's messenger was quick enough and did not allow himself to be caught. And in his head there was only one thought, not to let the monster get to its owner, who, without slowing down, continued to rush towards the stone sculpture of a toad. Regina kept him company, and somewhere behind the guy the lizard sent after him were trying to catch up. Finding himself very close to his goal, the young man announced that he had finally reached it. But at some point, Nigel suddenly began to feel his body a little differently than before. Noticing that things were not going well, he gradually fell forward. As he fell, he answered Regina's question, explaining that his body had suddenly become completely devoid of any strength. Lying on the stone floor, he wondered what was happening, because the guy couldn't move at all. Looking somewhere to the side, his companion did not answer the question, noting that it would be better for him to get up quickly. After all, those lizards that he left behind thanks to his speed skill were gradually catching up with him. And then she finally explained that applying acceleration to herself had exhausted the limits of Nigel's weak body, which is why he had lost control over his muscles. As he tried to crawl, the young man angrily noted that his companion's cards were incredibly difficult to use. But now, having gathered his strength, he called upon new cards, one of which began its action immediately, to the amazement of the approaching lizards, which, by the power of the wind skills summoned by the guy, were all lifted into the air. Watching his opponents fly, Nigel noticed that he had been dealt a pretty good card. Regina explained that the card he pulled out calls for a fairly powerful movement of air masses, where these air masses are capable of lifting and spinning an opponent of any weight category, with one caveat. Of course, the guy was interested in what kind of nuance there was in the application of this seemingly excellent skill. And Regina explained that these air masses only do what they do, lift opponents into the air without causing them any damage. This greatly disappointed the guy, who threw the card on the floor of the cave in anger, dissatisfied that he had once again gotten a less than perfect card. After this statement, the girl angrily explained that all this was happening because Nigel had taken all the cards at once. She then pointed out that if he had drawn one card, he might now have the permanent skill to summon that immortal goddess. But all this was completely unimportant now, since it was necessary to figure out how to destroy this stone toad. The young man, observing the flying lizards, also noticed that the duration of the skill of moving air masses was quite long. And then his attention was drawn to the prolonged loud roar of the dominant monster. Having paid attention to it, the guy noticed with fear how it was holding his armored lizard in one of its paws. At some point, the monster swung and forcefully threw the helpless creature into the stone floor of the cave. While Nigel watched the flight of his lizard's body, Regina warned the guy about the danger. After all, having finished with the young man's protector, the monster had already set course for the intruder into his domain. Each of his steps literally released incredible power and energy, spreading for tens of meters. Regina, watching the monster approach, continued to tell Nigel to be careful. But the guy decided to go all the way, once again preparing one of his cards for reuse on himself. Noticing this, his companion began to worry, asking Nigel what skill he had prepared to use. Just a few meters away from the monster, the young man replied that he had decided to use the acceleration skill again, which didn't exactly inspire Regina, who screamed that the guy's body might not be able to withstand it at all. Observing Nigel's condition, the girl tried to somehow attract his attention, but the monster had already managed to get within striking distance and lower its axe to where the young man stood. Nigel escaped death by gathering himself in time and using an acceleration skill. Moving straight towards the enemy's head, he noticed that now he didn't care about any indicators, characteristics, or statuses. After all, the decisive factor for him was how strong the will to live and win could be. Pushing off from his main opponent, he literally began to move through the air, pushing off from the lizards hovering everywhere. Having praised the guy for his intelligence, Regina also noted the appearance of new cards. Well, Nigel continued to move through the air, greatly surprising his opponent, who was unable to reach him. Having taken a favorable position, the young man used the acceleration skill to descend sharply, where he literally pierced with his body a stone vessel that was being squeezed by a toad. When his companion asked him about his condition, the young man replied that he had survived with incredible difficulty. And when the girl said that he didn't have to take such a risk, the guy explained that a weakling like he had been all his life would never miss a chance to become stronger. Nigel then turned his attention to the stone statue of the toad, saying that it was time to go out. But in any case, he no longer had the strength to move, and so he simply watched the monster approach. But then a lilac fog began to spread throughout the cave, which formed into a face that said that he was not satisfied with everything. The leading monster had already managed to stop its advance, watching this fog in amazement, which formed into a huge toad-like head, opening its huge mouth right in front of the monster. Watching as the toad swallowed the monster, Regina noted that it looked, as always, very disgusting. Nigel was very amazed by the power that the creature he had released possessed. Well, the creature itself has already managed to turn its attention to the guests of this world. Looking at the arrivals, the toad said that she could not believe what she was seeing in front of her now. After these words, Nigel asked in confusion what he had done to surprise the creature so much, and his companion demonstratively turned away. And then the creature cried out that it had been waiting for centuries for this meeting, where its wish was finally fulfilled. After all, the god of greed can see before him the highly respected goddess Regina in person. Throwing an angry look at the creature, the girl said that it could only open its mouth in human form, as otherwise it would emit a disgusting smell. Nigel could only watch the movements of this strange fog, which was now taking on a pink hue. After listening to Regina's demand, the toad noted that she was still as impudent and unprincipled as ever, adding that she would now fulfill the request and change her appearance. The girl told the guy to shut his mouth when he cheerfully tried to point out that Regina had an admirer. Preparing for the transformation, the toad began to make sweeping movements, calling for attention to what she was about to do. After which, all the fog filling the room seemed to quickly gather in one place. It even made the young man shield his eyes and cough as if he had inhaled dust. But when he could look again, he discovered that a dark-skinned girl was approaching him. For Regina, it was quite surprising to see the god of greed in such an unusual guise. Sitting astride Nigel, the god noted that he was now using this body, which he had successfully bargained for. The conversation between the two unusual creatures was interrupted by a voice coming from below, demanding that they immediately get off of him. And while the god in the guise of a girl was rising, the young man explained to Regina that he needed to recover a little after using the acceleration. Well, the god of greed, meanwhile, having carefully examined the object on which he landed, concluded that there was a man in front of him. And a moment later he concluded that, in all likelihood, this man and Regina were in a relationship, and when he started talking about the Treasury of Fate, his interlocutor categorically declared that he would not be able to get a single card from her reserves. Then the toad decided to try his luck by contacting directly the person who had received the treasured cards. And the first thing he did was remind the guy that he had literally just saved him from that huge monster. To which he immediately received a counter-argument, where Nigel reminded him that he was his liberator. But then his interlocutor resorted to such an action that forced him to again find himself on the floor of the cave on his fifth point of support. After all, the god of greed also showed his usual form, saying that he had saved the guy and now wanted to receive a worthy reward for it. The young man looked at his interlocutor in fascination, like a zombie repeating the words of the god of greed that he was his savior. And so the god in the guise of a girl approached Nigel, ordering him to transfer to him the power to control the cards. But then Regina intervened in what was happening, reminding him that God was forbidden to use power in such an indecent manner. Taking a completely carefree pitchfork, the god of greed declared that he would definitely gain power over the cards, and then he and Regina would be in a bundle. To this, the girl immediately noted that even if the entire universe began to fall apart at the seams, she would never have any dealings with the toad. Then her interlocutor said that in any case, the guy was obliged to repay him for saving him from the local dominant monster. At this point, Nigel himself joined the conversation, offering the god to make a deal with him. After all, he is ready to share cards, but in that case, God must offer him something in return. where the god of greed was very surprised by the courage of the man who decided to bargain with the god. Well, the young man continued, saying that he, of course, could not give him all the cards, but he can quite afford to give the toad a few treasured cards, which he immediately showed to his interlocutor. Watching this, Regina, of course, was very indignant regarding the actions of the young man. She tried to reason with the guy, telling him that he should stop bargaining, but he asked her to trust him, and so his plan began to work, where the god of greed declared that he had a method to restore Regina's powers. This will allow her to reach a qualitatively new level and recover her strength faster, which in turn will make the one who is in a relationship with her much stronger. After this, the god of greed said that he would tell about the method of restoring Regina's powers for 2 cards, plus the guy would have to give another one as payment for the rescue. After listening to the proposal, the girl categorically stated that the deal was unfair and therefore could not be acceptable. But then Nigel pointed out that the god of greed simply wanted the cards that belonged to his deck, and Regina began to understand what he was trying to do. And then he declared that he would give the toad as many as 7 cards, but on the condition that there was a fair deal between them. Such an offer could not leave indifferent the god of greed, who always wanted more. Well, the young man once again confirmed his intention to get 7 cards straight from the treasury and hand them over to his interlocutor. Overwhelmed with a sense of greed, the god could not utter a word, calculating that this was 4 whole cards more than he had asked for at the beginning of the negotiations. Well, Nigel's plan was to give the toad the lizard cards he had just recently received. He already imagined himself as a great strategist in the world of negotiations, but his companion noted that it was too early to rejoice. And then the god of greed suddenly declared that the young man's proposal seemed very strange to him. He literally felt that there was something fishy about the fact that he was suddenly offered exactly 7 cards. And so he began to be keenly interested in the reason why Nigel had made him such a generous offer, where he was ready to hand over exactly 7 cards, and not, for example, 6 or 8. This question left the guy stumped, as he had planned to simply get rid of the unnecessary cards. Well, God already called him a trickster who wants to activate something with the help of 7 cards from his deck. He demanded an answer from the young man, threatening him with the most terrible curse if he had any bad intentions against him. The situation was saved by Regina, who suddenly calmly stated that Nigel had decided to give him cards that he was unable to use. Because this guy is incredibly weak, he simply can't use most of the cards. Maintaining his bluff, the young man shouted that his companion should not dare call him a weakling. Well, for the god of greed, such an explanation was quite reasonable and sufficient, and now he happily declared that he was ready to make a deal and make a fair exchange. Regina whispered for Nigel to remove the expression of surprise from his face, so as not to ruin the deal. She also added that no rules are violated in such a deal, therefore the young man will not be punished. Noticing the negotiations between Regina and Nigel, the god of greed noted that he would no longer agree to a smaller number of cards, and the goddess continued to explain to the guy that after today's unsuccessful deal, the toad would be much more careful with them. God himself cheerfully noted that he would be so generous and would relieve the guy of something that he could not use anyway. Without deviating from the agreement, the young man pulled 7 unnecessary cards from the deck and handed them to his interlocutor, who immediately beamed with happiness, declaring that from that moment he became a god who owned the treasure of fate itself. But when he decided to look at what abilities he had received, he discovered 7 cards with the summoning of lizards, of which there were already plenty here. He couldn't understand where such useless cards could have come from in the deck, but the other side of this completely disadvantageous deal for him maliciously noted that they fulfilled their obligations and handed him 7 cards from the deck of fate. Of course, the god of greed could not break the terms of the deal, where all he could do was curse those who had so professionally deceived him. After some time, the new owner of the treasured cards was already surrounded by all 7 lizards. Looking at Nigel's armored lizard, the god of greed wondered if his 7 lizards would evolve to the same level. To this, the young man replied that if he loved them, they would grow up the way he wanted. After this, his interlocutor stated that he had suffered nothing but losses from this deal, for which he would pay double next time. Jumping on one of the lizards, he added that he would still show the impudent fellow real evolution. Left alone, Nigel and Regina began to discuss the fact that they needed to take the energy of the world, where the young man noted that all worlds are under the control of an organization of hunters. The girl immediately remembered how Nigel had already been detained by members of this organization. People from this organization constantly deprived hunters of their prey, and also took all the most profitable worlds for themselves. And in general, in order to enter another world, it is necessary to receive approval from this organization. Nigel's explanation was interrupted by a man who appeared next to him and noted that all those who go to other worlds without their knowledge automatically become criminals. And when the young man turned around, he saw in front of him the same man who had detained and interrogated him not long ago, and who was now menacingly declaring that they had met again. Looking at this guy with a flaming fist, the young man noticed that circumstances were not developing in his favor. Now this red-haired man sarcastically noted that Nigel did not have a single chance to claim that he had not gone to another world. At some point, the young man suddenly wondered how a man could even enter this secret place. A familiar female voice answered this question, noting that the controlling body did not need permission to enter. The approaching girl with the staff explained that they decided to conduct an inspection after a powerful flow of energy was detected. As she approached and spoke, Nigel tried to make out her face, hearing a familiar voice. Finally, this mysterious girl came out of the darkness, saying that last time they didn't properly introduce themselves to each other, calling herself Gina and the big guy next to her Hank. And then the young man finally remembered that this was the same assistant who had helped him with his release the last time. And when he voiced this, Gina explained that she sometimes does odd jobs around the office, but mostly she's the same hunter. After listening to the girl, Nigel cheerfully noted that in this case she could again help him by holding back her impulsive colleague while he left this place. But Hank suddenly activated his fire abilities, noting that this was the second time they had found themselves in a place where the main monster had been destroyed, and where Nigel was present. In this regard, he has a question about how such a weakling is able to destroy the most powerful monsters. Regina, watching Hank's display of power, immediately noticed that a spirit of the highest rank was clearly involved. It was very unexpected to see a man who could make a deal to cooperate with such a strong spirit. Gina asked her colleague to try not to kill this young guy, and so the man rushed forward, shouting that now he would test the true strength of this guy, where Nigel himself watched in horror as this blazing man approached. But when the distance was reduced to just a couple of meters, an armored lizard suddenly appeared in front of its owner, who blocked this incredibly powerful attack without much difficulty. Where after Hank's limb touched the lizard's body, the fire spread by the man's hand disappeared without a trace. While Hank was surprised that his flames dissipated upon contact with the lizard, he also found it interesting. Without hiding his joy, the man rushed at his opponent, continuing to try to attack him. Gina, watching the progress of the fight, noted to herself that although she had asked her colleague not to overdo it, his opponent turned out to be much more capable. After all, Hank had a very specific fire skill, which he acquired from the spirit of fire, where its flame could not only burn, but would never go out until its owner wanted it to. But the lizard now confronting Hank clearly had some immunity to the effects of this flame. Nigel, who was watching the progress of the confrontation, was very pleased that his lizard was so strong that it was able to withstand this clearly not weak opponent. But his faithful companion Regina explained that it was not the lizard himself that blocked the fiery skills, but her abilities. Because the attacking man is also given the power of fire by spirits who don't really like lizards. However, despite the fact that his pet had managed to restrain Hank for now, the difference in strength between them was colossal. Where this man was much stronger than this huge armored lizard. Only after throwing the enemy back, Hank, without waiting a second, immediately rushed towards him to continue the attack. Watching the approaching fiery fist, the lizard noted to himself that he would not be able to defend himself from this blow. And now the lizard was already flying to the side, once again thrown back by the efforts of his opponent. Hank was incredibly pleased with the battle, suggesting that the lizard get to his feet and continue the fun. And just as he was beginning to take a comfortable position to continue the battle, he suddenly heard a call from behind him. It was Gina who reminded them of their true purpose in coming to this world, which was to find out how a guy with no powers managed to stay alive. Nigel himself had already managed to get closer to his lizard, which now looked more like a small dragon, and was trying to understand what his condition was. At some point, Hank caught his attention by addressing the young man rather rudely. Showing the seriousness of his intentions, he demanded that the guy answer his questions immediately. And to begin with, he was interested in the reason why this lizard was standing in defense of the young man. The man sincerely could not understand why the lizard was ready to give his life for some weakling. After hearing the question, Nigel instantly realized that this man's goal today was definitely not to detain him like last time. He easily guessed that these two simply wanted to understand how he, who had no powers or abilities, was able to survive in other worlds. Now it remained to decide what to do next, and whether it was worth telling these people about the power he had received from the Treasury of Fate. Regina, who literally read his thoughts, immediately declared that he should not and could not under any circumstances tell these people about his power, because they could take the cards. Having listened to his companion's arguments, the young man asked her what would be the best thing for him to do in this case, and Regina advised him to simply admit that he had been illegally entering other worlds, which would allow him to get off with a prison term of only about 6 months. At that moment, Hank activated, noticing how the guy was talking to himself. Having received no answers to his questions, the man said that in that case, Nigel and his lizard would have to go with him for interrogation under different conditions. The lizard saw his opponent reaching out to his master, and with all his soul he wanted to resist this and protect the guy. And so he was able to activate the skill of improved regeneration, after which he instantly came to life and struck Hank with his tail. Nigel, who also did not expect such agility from the lizard, watched in amazement as his pet continued to change shape, where not only did the previously severed limb grow back, but his entire armor turned fiery red. Regina was also quite surprised, noting that this lizard was able to absorb the power of the enemy's flame, and thanks to this, evolve. Hank was incredibly happy that he could continue the fight with this opponent, who was able to give him worthy competition. During the confrontation, the man also noticed that all of the lizard's characteristics had increased, including speed. Gina was no less surprised than the others, as she didn't believe that monsters could evolve like that. And so, in the girl's head, disparate pieces of information began to form one big picture. She remembered how they waited for the group to emerge from that world to take all the loot. After all, no one dared to enter inside, since the monster living there was incredibly strong. And after information about this place leaked, only this guy was able to leave that world. And this meant that Nigel in that world was able to obtain some previously unknown power, which allowed him to survive. While Gina was making all these logical conclusions, the dragon and Hank continued to fight, where once again both opponents exchanged powerful blows. But all this only made the man even more excited, which was literally reflected on his face. Noting to himself that he hadn't met such a strong opponent in a long time, Hank also noted that he was now using all his strength. With a quick movement of his hand and calling upon all his power, he prepared to deliver another powerful blow. Where with this one blow, Hank intended to end this confrontation in his favor. His attacking hand quickly approached the armored dragon, but then Nigel came to the aid of his pet, taking out and using a speed increase card on him. After which, the guy shouted for his pet to dodge these deadly blows. The acquired speed increase skill allowed the dragon to avoid the enemy's powerful attack, just as none of Hank's subsequent blows were able to catch the agile lizard. With another blow, the man literally broke through the stone floor of the cave, but still did not hit the lizard. Nigel could only marvel at the incredible strength of this man, where he was already beginning to have doubts about whether this guy was even human. Hank's final attack was so powerful that its energy spread several meters from the epicenter. Straightening up, the man asked Nigel in an extremely displeased voice about what he had just done. After all, by giving the lizard a boost, he was preventing a fair fight between two real men. Listening to Hank, both Regina and Nigel immediately noticed that he was currently in a state of wild rage. And then the girl noted that if we were talking about battles between men, then everyone should be men, with which Nigel immediately agreed. But when the gist of what was said reached him, he asked who Regina was hinting at, and she explained that she meant the armored lizard. After all, at first glance it became clear that this lizard was not male, but female. Then the girl completely stunned the guy when she noticed that this lizard fell deeply in love with Nigel, even evolving for his sake, where if this continues, she will generally turn into a human. After listening to Regina, the young man noted that there could be no feelings between them, because they were of different types. At this point, Hank reminded us of himself, first noting through clenched teeth that it was not the difference in species that was important, but the feelings. And then the enraged man added that someone not only interfered with his battle, but was now brazenly ignoring dialogue with him. Having shouted that he was going to break all the guy's bones, the enraged man rushed into the attack. Realizing that he would be unable to do anything at all, the young man watched in fear as the enemy's hand approached. There were only centimeters left before the blow was delivered, when some new force appeared between Hank and Nigel, transformed into a powerful stream of light energy, the effect of which was directed exclusively at Hank. While Nigel was in a state of shock, Regina noticed that high-level magic had just been used before their eyes. The girl was amazed by the fact that so many strong masters had gathered in one place at once. Meanwhile, Gina, who had stopped her partner's impulse, told him to stop acting up, to which Hank, lying on the floor of the cave, noted that anyone else would have definitely gone to the angels from such a blow. The girl, however, noted in her heart that she no longer knew what to do with her companion, who always came to the same thing. And now she was already conducting educational work with Hank, reminding him that they had come only to talk to a guy who could die from one blow from Hank. Her speech was interrupted by Nigel, who pointed out that the girl and man who had appeared had no right to arrest them, since he will insist that he ended up here by accident. There are no grounds for detention. Then he started talking about how there were a lot of real criminals going to other worlds, and they were focusing their efforts on some guy who wasn't dangerous. After listening to the young man's arguments, Gina noted that he apparently did not fully understand what their organization was doing. To this, the young man replied that there was nothing to understand, since the organization had monopolized control over the entrances to the worlds and was simply collecting all the goods. But Gina disagreed, explaining that they reduce the danger to people by dividing them into classes and assessing their strength, then allowing entry only to worlds that match their level. Other worlds are home to an incredible number of different creatures that are still unknown to mankind. But besides monsters and valuable resources, there are also priceless artifacts that are far ahead of the development of any civilization. These artifacts can grant unimaginable power that cannot end up in the wrong hands. They also conduct investigations of all incidents and assess how dangerous a particular person who has acquired wealth by force by chance may be. And then Gina changed the subject, noting that Nigel had obviously managed to get something in that world. And the proof of this is the lizard standing next to him, which the guy controls. In this regard, Gina could only provide the young man with two possible options for how events could develop. In one case, the guy confesses everything and receives the most severe punishment. And in the other, after confessing, he joins them, using the power he received for good. Hank, in turn, suggested having another fight with the lizard, after which the guy would be able to think again. On this note, the conversation was interrupted by a new participant in the events who appeared in the cave, who recommended that Nigel not trust the members of the organization. After which everyone turned their heads sharply, trying to get a good look at the girl who had decided to intervene in the course of events. Nigel, looking up, wondered not only who she was, but how they all got to this secret place. As if reading Nigel's mind, the girl declared that she was a true friend of the owner of the Cards of Fate, after which the girl, who partly resembled a fox, introduced herself, calling herself Roxanne. And now, finally, she announced that she would help her new friend free himself from the oppression of the organization. When the fox finished, there was a deathly silence in the cave. Nigel was the first to speak, and was very surprised to see a cross between a human and a fox in front of him, which looked incredibly attractive. Hank also did not stand aside, saying that he liked cats much more, but foxes were also not bad. At this point, Roxanne reminded everyone of herself again, saying that since everyone liked her, then she would take Nigel with her, if no one objected. But Hank was clearly against it, shouting that she could only do this over his dead body. However, this statement did not bother the girl at all, who immediately jumped down from the steep rock. Pushing Gina aside, the man declared that he would now deal with this impudent woman. As Hank watched the fox approach, he noticed that she was quite brave, and he couldn't wait to see what she was capable of. Without responding to what was said, Roxana only uttered the word illusion. After which, several copies of the approaching fox immediately appeared before the man's eyes. Both Hank and his companion Gina were completely stunned as they watched the chaotic movement of several foxes. The man could not believe that illusions could be so realistic that they could not be distinguished from the original. But all of this was absolutely real, where representatives of the organization were literally surrounded by clones. And at this time, one of the foxes was running with all its might towards Nigel and his dragon, who were standing to the side. Enchanted by Roxana, the young man could not take his eyes off the fox who was approaching him. Well, his dragon, deciding that the fox was a threat to his master, prepared for battle. But the sweet girl was only amused by the lizard's behavior. Without any difficulty, Roxanne was able to get around the dragon that blocked her path and tried to attack the enemy. Nigel, watching her actions, was amazed at how agile this girl was, and now Roxanne was standing right in front of him, saying that she had come to take the guy with her. But the young man hardly listened to her, looking with interest at her real fox-clawed paw. At the same time, Gina noticed that the fox had already managed to reach its goal, and Roxanne had already placed her paw on Nigel's shoulder, suggesting that he just relax and leave everything else to her. Having managed to escape from the illusionary environment, Hank quickly approached the guy and the fox, shouting that he would not let them escape. Roxana, completely ignoring him, placed her second paw on the dragon's shoulder, saying that he was coming with them. The girl held Nigel and his dragon by the shoulders, where they all watched Hank approach them, which, just a moment later, dealt a powerful blow to the place where the entire company was located. But this blow fell on empty air, as Roxanne, Nigel, and the dragon dissolved into clouds of pink smoke. Gina could only think about what kind of strange character had come to help the guy. Having moved into the human world, the young man, accompanied by his new girlfriend, was already leaving the sewer tunnel. When he noted that he would now probably be put on the wanted list, the fox calmed him down, reminding him that she was now with him. This caused the young man to focus his close attention on her, and so the young man asked the girl to explain who she was and where she came from. But before she had time to answer the first question, he was already asking whether her fox attributes were real, how she knew about the Cards of Fate, and whether the girl had a boyfriend. While Roxana was trying to calm her interlocutor's ardor, recommending asking one question at a time, Regina, who was nearby, noted that she also had a question. The first thing she noticed was that the fox could clearly see her, unlike everyone else. And therefore she would very much like to know which of the spirits sent the girl who came from another world. This caused the young man to experience a new shock, where he never expected that he would meet a creature from another world in his interlocutor. The soldiers lined up and stood at attention and greeted a young man named Nate as he passed by. At some point, the guy stopped and attracted the attention of one of the soldiers. After he inquired about when the workday would finally end, a soldier noted that Nate had just arrived, and another added that it was only halfway through the workday. Then the soldiers started talking about how the guy hadn't been at work for a week, and so Ms. Gina ordered that Nate not be released when he showed up. Realizing that he couldn't get out of it, the young man said that he would be in one of the rooms, and that he had an operational meeting for everyone. Once he was inside, he decided that he would be able to get some sleep. But as it turned out, Gina and Hank were already waiting for him there, noting that Nate would be able to sleep and rest another time. The young man wanted to run away, citing urgent business, but the man quickly appeared behind him, noting that it would be completely impolite to leave like that. And then Hank added that they really needed a capable worker like Nate right now, who tried to refer to the need to compile a lot of reports. This pointless conversation was stopped by Gina, who called out to both interlocutors, and quickly put them in their place, reminding them who is in charge here, and who always has the last word. However, this did not really calm Nate down, who stated that he did not want to work overtime at all, but preferred to receive a salary for simply lying on the couch. His eloquent speech was interrupted by Gina's announcement that they had a new owner of the artifact, and when Nate suggested that they wanted to send him to fight this newcomer, the girl reassured him, saying that this new owner had not yet fully awakened. A few seconds later, Gina sent Nate all the data about the new object, where she once again expressed her indignation regarding the ringtone that the guy had set on his cell phone. And so he got acquainted with the personality of Nigel, who until recently was just a scumbag. But after visiting one of the worlds, he gained power. Nate's job was to find and bring this guy into the organization, so that no one else could take him and turn him against them. After all, it will be much easier for someone who has also made a deal with the goddess to find a common language with his own kind. Meanwhile, Roxanne, who continued to keep Nigel company, at some point stated that the organization was hunting him due to the lack of a license, which she offered to help him obtain. And when asked how they would manage to do this, the girl once again suggested that the young man simply rely on her, where, according to her assumption, as soon as they show their strength, the guy will be provided with a license. After listening to his companion, the young man assumed that she meant participating in the team tournament. But for this, the team must consist of at least 3 people, whereas there are only 2 of them. Then Nigel glanced around the room where many hunters were gathered, noting that this time an incredible number of participants had gathered here. Meanwhile, the little fox asked the young man and Regina to wait here while she signed up their team for participation. Here, the goddess noted that in the world of people there is no race of humanoid foxes, and therefore the appearance of such an individual could be dangerous. But Nigel objected, noting that their world was full of people who had what was called hunter syndrome. The manifestation of this syndrome is that people who carry out cleanups and defeat monsters are transformed. Apparently, it is a matter of absorbing their energy, or even parts of the soul, which affects the physiology of the hunter. After listening to the young man, Regina said that this was about those who were susceptible to the influence of physiological changes. But if we talk about their new friend, the fox, she is a creature that does not originally belong to this world. At one point, Nigel asked a reasonable question about the reason why they couldn't see Roxanne's spirit, which she was connected to. And then Regina explained that for some reason this half-girl, half-fox was transported to their world, and her spirit remained in the world from which she came. This provided an explanation as to why Roxanne wanted to return to herself so badly. At that moment, the fox herself returned, cheerfully announcing that they had signed up to participate in the tournament. Regina continued to watch how Nigel reacted to Roxanne, who noted out loud that he had never had such a charming partner. Listening to the young man and watching Roxana approach, Regina noted to herself that he had definitely gone crazy, falling for the fox. Still holding the participant's card in her paw, the girl declared that now there was only a little left to do, where they simply needed to defeat everyone. And when Nigel reminded her that there were only 2 of them, Roxanne objected, saying that she had written down 3. Regina, of course, assumed that the 3rd one meant her, and prepared to object. But suddenly both she and Nigel saw that the participant's card contained a picture of a black man. When he asked who the man was, the fox replied that it was a girl, after which she cheerfully stated that she had to try and falsify some data. This statement greatly surprised the young man, who did not understand why it was necessary to falsify the data. And Roxana explained that there was simply no other way for them to get into the tournament. Then the young man, also deciding that the fictional character meant Regina, asked the fox how she could fight if no one could even see her. To this, his interlocutor explained that she was not referring to the goddess at all, but to the armored lizard that the guy had. When Nigel tried to object, reminding her that his dragon was not quite human, Roxanne reminded him that she was not quite human either. Then the fox noticed that, to her great surprise, people were the only ones in this world who had any intelligence. At this point, Regina intervened in the conversation and noted that the fox's idea wasn't so bad. After all, if you work a little on the armored dragon, including on the perception of the world, then turning it into a human will not be difficult. And now the girl has already spread the cards in front of her, where, to Nigel's indignation regarding the use of cards, she declared that she is still a goddess. At that moment, the young man heard a familiar voice behind him calling him by name. Turning around, he saw a boy and a girl standing in front of him, where the girl said hello, and the boy sarcastically stated that this scum was still trying to become a hunter, where he was very surprised that his friend Matt showed hunter syndrome. And while he was looking at the guy's face, Betty, standing next to him, was glad that Nigel was alive, because she had heard about the death of all the participants in the sortie in which the young man took part. Meanwhile, Matt was quite rudely declaring that Nigel would be better off just going back to the trash heap, and when he reminded him of his father's death, saying that the guy shouldn't have come here, Nigel advised him to shut up. Then the guy switched to the fox, saying that she had definitely made a mistake with her choice, since she had joined the team of an incredible non-entity, but she only laughed in response, thanking the stranger for the care he had shown her. But after that, she advised the young man never to point his finger at other people. At some point, the whole world turned upside down before Matt's eyes, which was accompanied by Roxanne's words that this gesture was extremely indecent on his part. Nigel was simply speechless as he watched the fox's efforts to make his interlocutor's body make a complete turn in the air. When the guy landed on his head, Roxanne noted that even though she seemed like a cutie from the outside, she wasn't going to tolerate her friend's insults. Naturally, this behavior of the fox angered Matt quite a lot, who cursed at her. He quickly jumped to his feet, declaring that it would not be difficult for him to beat up the girl as well, while Betty held him back. Well, Nigel thanked his friend for her intervention, adding that she didn't quite understand the specifics of his relationship with this guy, where he is actually his good friend, who worries about his fate, and therefore tries to protect him from danger by any means. Nigel then approached Matt, noting that much had changed since their last meeting. And when Matt asked him to explain what exactly, the young man cheerfully noted that he couldn't tell him everything, but he could definitely say that he was now stronger than his friend. Naturally, Matt didn't believe what was said, deciding that Nigel was simply fooling around. But after a while, he added that if he could hold out and meet him at the tournament, then he would be ready to believe his words. To this, the young man declared that he would not only meet him, but would also smash him to smithereens. Following this statement, Matt promised to talk to their leader about accepting Nigel if he won, which he immediately refused. At some point, Regina intervened in the conversation, asking the guy if he was really going to fight Matt, to which Nigel answered quite affirmatively. He had already managed to forget that his dragon, which he had expected to use as a skill, was participating in the competition as an independent character. The first participants of the tournament were already in the arena when the host announced the participation of 16 teams today, as well as a good cash prize. The second presenter also noted that today among the participants there are quite a lot of new teams that have not previously taken part in such events. Then the names of those who were now in the arena were announced, where in order to win it was necessary to win 2 of the 3 rounds. The commentator noted that Matt is a fairly capable hunter, on whom great hopes are pinned. But today he had to fight an opponent who was a level higher than Matt himself. Watching the fight, Nigel noticed that his friend had become much stronger since their last meeting. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice how someone approached him from behind, placing their elbow on his shoulder. It was the god of greed, accompanied by his old acquaintance Stan, and his healthiest henchman. After the extortionist leader said something about how small the world was, Nigel asked him what he was doing in the tournament's break room. But instead of the man, the toad answered him, saying that, unlike their deal, his deal with these guys had gone much more successfully. Having started to say that their agreement was also quite good, the guy suddenly stopped, focusing on information about a certain deal between the extortionists and this god. He couldn't believe that this bespectacled guy had made some kind of pact with the god of greed. And so Stan explained that he could not forgive the humiliation he had experienced. And at the moment when he was looking for an opportunity for revenge, this creature appeared to him. Listening to the man, Nigel couldn't wrap his head around the fact that his former creditor had made a deal with God. But he suddenly burst into tears, whining pitifully that after this agreement he had absolutely nothing left. Here, God himself intervened in the dialogue, explaining that Stan wanted to find Nigel and take revenge, which he organized in exchange for the fact that these 2 men were now his eternal slaves. Now the boy looked at this man with pity, and he noted that he could not resist the orders he received. But the longer he listened to his suffering, the more it began to irritate him. He prayed for someone to save him from the crying Stan on one side and the pestering god of greed on the other. During this time, Matt, who was participating in the fight, had already managed to defeat his stronger and more experienced opponent. Well, the hosts called on the audience to give him a well-deserved round of applause, after which they announced that his team had advanced to the next stage. While talking to a colleague, the female host reminded him that he was rooting not for Matt, but for his opponent, which he did not deny. But a moment later, both of them turned to the other two teams that were about to enter the arena. Hearing his name, the young man began to look around in search of Roxana and Regina. As if sensing his excitement, the little fox immediately appeared behind him, asking for forgiveness for keeping him waiting. Turning around, Nigel was speechless as his precious fox was not the only one returning to him. Everyone else who was nearby also looked with interest at some previously unseen creature. Well, the satisfied fox cheerfully noted that it took some time to bring the armored dragon's equipment into compliance. Regina also appeared and told the guy that no magic would allow him to notice what she had managed to create. At this point, the invitation to the teams to the arena was announced, after which the god of greed said goodbye until they met again during the confrontation. Looking at the toad, the young man noticed that their opponents were some kind of registered team. His interlocutor was clearly pleased with his superiority in the matter of information, noting that the boy still did not know much. And a moment later, the god of greed, pointing to the men behind him, announced that they were the announced team. Nothing could have surprised Nigel more than the realization that their first opponent in this tournament was a god. Meanwhile, the hosts noted with interest that both teams entering the arena were new to the tournament. But since both teams are distinguished by special people, the confrontation promises to be quite interesting. While the hosts were announcing the lineup of Roxana's team, the girl only had time to respond to the attention of her numerous fans. Then it was the turn of the opposing team, where the hosts noted that all the hopes of this team, apparently, were placed on their leader, the girl. The fight had not yet begun when the deity offered the young man a bet with his cards as stake. But this time, Nigel refused to make any pacts with the god of greed. While the teams were preparing, the commentator announced the rules, according to which victories can be achieved by points, among other things. And while he was speaking, the entire audience sat in complete silence and in anticipation of an excellent fight. The man finished by explaining that the scoring would be done by a system that assessed the damage inflicted by each individual attack. To win, you had to score a certain number of points or win 2 out of 3 rounds, which made the selection of fighters very important. Both the fox and Nigel were pleased with these rules, because to win it was enough to defeat Stan and Todd, which they did not see as difficult. But Regina doubted her chances of winning this confrontation, which greatly surprised Nigel. After all, a greedy toad, who was still a deity despite the limited opportunities in the human world, also came forward to participate in the competition. The best option would be if Nigel went against the toad, and the fox and dragon against the other two. But if the god was not matched with a guy, then it was far from certain that he would be able to defeat Todd or Stan. All this made the young man think hard about the team's tactics and strategy. His thoughts were interrupted by the announcement of the fox, who offered himself as the first participant. Regina doubted this decision, because the god of greed could have gone first, but the fox said that it made no difference to her who she fought. She then went on to say that according to the myths of her world, the god of greed rarely appeared on his own, preferring to simply control others. The girl also noted that she always has a chance to simply win by scoring the required number of points. And when Roxana came forward and was introduced by the commentators, the audience literally exploded with emotion, addressing the beautiful girl with the best wishes and even declarations of love. But at some point the fox noticed who was starting to come out from the enemy's side. Watching the purple smoke begin to spread, Nigel noted that luck had passed them by today. After all, the god of greed himself decided to go out against Roxana first, expressing hope that the girl would not disappoint him. While in the girl's body, the god said that it was impossible to outwit the cunning man, and so he simply suggested that the fox surrender immediately. Roxanne laughed and said that if that happened, viewers would think that their team was deliberately giving up ground. She also added that contrary to her opponent's belief, she is not that weak. Immediately after which the fox jumped high into the air, and the commentators immediately announced that a member of Nigel's team had gone on the attack first. Everyone was literally shocked when Roxanne, during the flight, suddenly split into several similar creatures. Upon landing, the foxes surrounded the deity of greed as the commentators continued to note the spread of purple smoke. The only one who was not at all impressed by the fox's trick was the god himself, who found her actions simply ridiculous. And now the commentators have already noticed that the girl from the other team began to control her smoke, apparently preparing for an attack, At the same time, it was also noted that the fox's skill was not just a cloning skill, since each copy of it performed independent movements that were different from the other copies. At the same time, the fox herself carefully watched as the body of each of her copies began to be enveloped in smoke, which, through the efforts of the deity, suddenly began to form into dense, large spikes that pierced the bodies of the foxes surrounding the toad. Only now did Stan begin to believe that the one who called himself a god could really be one with such abilities. Nigel was beginning to worry that his dear little fox was now in mortal danger. Regina fully agreed with this, adding that she would definitely have a hard time in this confrontation, because she knew that the god of greed had the skill of sucking out magical energy. He uses his purple smoke to destroy the copies of the fox and then neutralize her. But suddenly the girl made a short pause, causing Nigel to start to get nervous. And when Regina continued, she stated that from the very beginning of the fight, she did not feel the presence of the fox itself in the arena. Meanwhile, the god of greed continued to destroy the copies created by his opponent. At the same time, he managed to cheerfully declare that the clones would soon run out, and then the fox would be neutralized. Continuing to revel in her own greatness, the toad did not notice Roxana's appearance right behind her. Noticing that the deity was probably already tired of waiting, the nimble girl moved to active action. Having managed to turn around, the god of greed could only watch the approach of his opponent, which quickly struck him with its clawed fox paw right in the face. Well, the commentators enthusiastically shouted about how skillfully and technically the everyone's favorite acted, managing to carry out the first effective attack. Roxana herself had no intention of stopping at the success she had achieved, asking God not to take it personally. At the same time, the girl noted that she should definitely get bonus points for the incredible show she put on. Having knocked her opponent to the arena floor, the little fox began to beat him on the head with all her might, where at some point the commentators even began to worry that she might accidentally kill her opponent. Regina noticed that the fox had quite good skills, and Nigel, who was standing next to her, was already happy that victory was in their hands. But the little goddess immediately added that it was too early to celebrate, since the toad always has an ace up its sleeve. Stan, who could count on being freed from slavery under such circumstances, did not hide his joy at the way the fox was beating the one who enslaved him. And then at some point the god of greed declared that it was not so easy to kill the body he had inhabited. And the fox, literally sitting on him, was very surprised that her opponent was still conscious. And so the toad attacked the fox with his fog, but she was able to react quite successfully and avoid damage. Roxanne did a somersault and landed a little to the side of the place where she had been beating the god in the girl's body a few seconds ago. She immediately smiled and noted that her opponent definitely shouldn't be so nervous about some tournament. The god of greed himself, hiding in the clouds of smoke he emitted, noted that his opponent was quite capable. The commentators watching the fight were amazed that the fox's opponent, after such a powerful attack, simply rose to her feet, calling on some kind of ghostly monster for help. A disappointed Stan meanwhile wondered how strong the creature whose slave he had become was. Regina, watching the toad increase its strength, noted that if this continued, the body in which the deity had settled might not withstand it. The fox's keen eye also did not miss the fact that her opponent was ready to even destroy his body for the sake of victory. The fox itself, Nigel, and that painted girl all made contracts with the gods. But while Nigel did it voluntarily, that girl does not control herself, since she is subordinate to the toad. Of course, it was a god who was fighting the fox now, but the vessel he was using for the battle was a very ordinary person. In this regard, it was quite surprising that the fox's powerful attacks could not knock out this girl, who could clearly take a hit. But all this was not important now, since there was very little left to win on points. And so Roxanne released her clones again, who were immediately attacked by the god opposing her. When Nigel noted that the illusions would hardly help the fox for long, since the toad's smoke covers a large area, Regina noted that these clones are not quite what the guy thinks about them. Because Roxanne's real body could be all the illusions at once, or some part of them, or just one fox. Each clone of the fox reflects its own timeline, and therefore, as soon as something happens to one of them, she immediately manifests in another copy. The young man did not expect that his girlfriend could literally move from one copy of herself to another. Well, Regina said that now she can guess which deity the fox made a deal with. Meanwhile, the fight continued, and the commentators did not have time to give brief overviews of the events taking place in the arena, where the fox once again managed to get behind her opponent, to whom she was preparing to deliver the winning blow. But as soon as she touched his body, it turned into the same purple smoke that was everywhere in the arena. Roxanne couldn't believe that it was an illusion in front of her, because she felt the blow. It reminded the girl of her own abilities, which she used constantly. When she also noted that she could not sense the enemy's presence, someone standing behind her asked if it was him she was looking for, and now the Dark Fox was already attacking Roxana, noting that it was time for him to get some glasses. Finally, the God of Greed managed to get his opponent with a strong enough blow. Flying away to the side, Roxanne still could not believe what she was now seeing before her eyes, and the girl's opponent noted that she had amazing abilities that he would very much like to try on himself. The commentators completely stopped understanding what was happening, because Roxanne was now attacked by one of her own illusions, and the girl opposing her had completely disappeared from the arena. And now the Dark Fox was already expressing her guesses regarding Roxanne's use of her abilities, and she noticed that her opponent had not simply transformed into one of her copies, which the God of Greed immediately confirmed, saying that one of his main skills is appropriating someone else's power. And since the basis of the fox's power is to move into one of the clones at a critical moment in life, what will she do if a future situation arises where her body is captured? Roxanne immediately realized that if she continued to use her abilities, sooner or later the god would take over her body, and he was already calling on the fox to continue the fight, release the clones and give him the opportunity to see even more possible outcomes. The commentators managed to guess that the Dark Fox was Roxanne's former opponent, who had simply changed her appearance in some unknown way. And suddenly the fox raised one of its paws, which made commentators speculate about what would happen next. Nigel also encouraged the girl, who needed just 1 point to win. The toad was just waiting for the fox to start attacking, preparing to give her the victory, but in return to get a new powerful body. But suddenly Roxana turned to the tournament hosts, declaring that she was giving up, where the God of Greed's eyes literally popped out of his head from such an unexpected statement. But despite the refusal to continue the fight, the crowd's love for the fox did not fade at all, where she only managed to respond with signs to words of support and love. The young man did not understand the meaning of this act at all, but Regina found him incredibly literate. After all, the game wasn't worth the candle if this beautiful fox was left without her body. As she left the arena, the girl thanked her opponent for allowing her to beat him up and get 9 points for it. He had already managed to return to his previous body, sending 1,000 curses towards his opponent. Returning to her team, the fox asked everyone for forgiveness for having to lose. But the little goddess supported the girl, saying that she had done the right thing by not allowing that vile god to enslave her. She also noted that she now knew the god with whom the fox had made a deal. After all, Roxanne, like Nigel, also made a lucrative agreement with the goddess of fate herself. And when Nigel asked why Regina hadn't spoken about this before, she explained that she had only just realized it herself. However, the fox's reaction allowed us to assume that she herself does not know which deity she works with in conjunction. When she asked if she had a deal with Regina, Nigel's brain began to slowly melt. Then Regina noted out loud that both of her interlocutors had not been particularly bright lately, after which she had to explain that there are actually 3 goddesses of fate. Their conversation was interrupted by the hosts, who asked the next 2 participants to enter the arena. It was decided to postpone the conversation, and Nigel himself was going to leave the arena, deciding that if he lost, he would simply go home. But then an armored dragon caught up with the owner and declared that he would now go to fight. As the lizard moved forward, it uttered individual words that indicated that their team would definitely win the fight. Well, Nigel himself was quite surprised that his dragon had started to speak so well. From the side of the God of Greed's team, the big guy Todd, whose face was always hidden by a mask, headed into the arena. And his exit was immediately announced by commentators, where this man was introduced as one of the best debt collectors. Well, the armored dragon was presented as a mysterious hunter who was bitten by a lizard during one of his raids, which caused him to change his physiology greatly. Commentators paid special attention to Toda's weapon, which, based on its appearance alone, could be determined to be of unusual origin. After these words, Nigel began to remember that he had seen this huge axe somewhere before. When Stan expressed confusion as to when his henchmen began using such a weapon, the God of Greed pointed out that it was his gift to the man. And then the toad gave the order to destroy the enemy, where the appeal was addressed to the very same monster with which Nigel's armored dragon had once fought. And so both opponents in the arena prepared for the start of the confrontation. Commentators couldn't even imagine how this big guy would be able to handle such a powerful weapon. And when Stan noted that Todd couldn't handle an axe, his interlocutor immediately explained that this was no longer quite the Todd he knew, because before the tournament started, the God of Greed managed to make some improvements. In exchange for lifelong slavery, the toad gave him powers that were inherent in the very monster that Nigel's lizard fought in another world. Stan couldn't believe that Todd had agreed to such a contract, and the deity standing next to him explained that this simpleton still didn't know the terms of the deal, since he was so happy when he received the axe. After which God noticed that men themselves always lend money, hiding the fact that the interest rate is high. Nigel shouted at the dragon to be careful, and the dragon told himself that this time, losing was not an option. Besides, he now has an excellent chance to pay back for the humiliation he had to endure in the other world. As soon as the start of the fight was announced, Todd immediately rushed into the attack with his bulky weapon. But the dragon was able to get out of the line of attack, after which he struck his opponent in return with a kick right to the head. This was enough to shatter the mask hiding the man's face into tiny pieces. But the dragon did not stop there. Another blow was dealt, and the commentators announced that their team had received another point. The dragon never expected that his opponent could be so agile, where after he threw his arm out to the side, Todd forcefully directed his opponent's body movement straight into the floor. Commentators watching the fight noted that Todd had probably found a weak spot in his opponent's defense. Nigel was very worried about the dragon as he watched it being beaten by a huge man. Meanwhile, the big guy, continuing to press his opponent to the arena floor, prepared his axe. At that moment, the dragon's entire body was suddenly covered in flames, which Todd certainly didn't expect. A real firestorm literally engulfed the entire body of the big guy, who was forced to let go of his opponent's head. The delight of the commentators and spectators knew no bounds, because no one expected that the dragon would be able to use such a skill. Representatives of the organization were already in the room, noting that they had not expected such a powerful evolution. At one point, Hank suggested detaining the entire group immediately, but Gina calmed him down, explaining that it was not the time yet. After all, the girl was very interested in what this lizard could eventually turn into. The commentators kept noting that Todd was having a very difficult time now, as his opponent was not stopping the flow of flames. Almost breathing fire, the man shouted that he would destroy the obnoxious lizard. Very soon he managed to escape from the fire, where a strange symbol could already be seen on his body. And when he tore off his clothes, and his body began to be covered with scales, the man declared that he remembered everything, and now he would punish the traitor. Hank and Gina, who were keeping their eyes on the arena, came to the conclusion that it was getting more and more interesting with every passing second. The god of greed only chuckled when Stan wondered why Todd had mutated, since he hadn't been on the cleanups. And then the Toad noted that she herself had not expected that the essence of the one whose power Todd possessed would come out. Regina noted with concern that the god of greed seemed to have his brains askew. After all, now what lived in the other world has completely absorbed Todd and controls his body. Well, all Nigel could do was acknowledge that all their affairs and plans had gone awry. Despite the enemy's transformation, the armored dragon had no intention of retreating, even though he had to fight again with someone who had already managed to defeat him once. After the fat man attacked, the armored dragon was able to gather itself and launch a counterattack. It was the final attack that marked the victory of the Fox team, which was immediately reported by the commentators. Nigel was pleased with this outcome, noting that great strength was of no importance in this fight. All his joy was ruined by Regina, who reminded the guy that he needed to figure out how to at least survive the next fight. Meanwhile, the commentators asked the medics to come up to the arena and check on Todd, who was still lying down after the final blow he received. Nigel greeted his armored dragon joyfully, praising the warrior for his victory. But at some point, some sounds began to be heard behind the winner. And a moment later, the commentators announced that Todd had managed to get back on his feet, but was looking and behaving rather strangely. Noticing how the man prepared to continue the fight, he was demanded to immediately lay down his arms if he did not want to lose his qualifications. And the young man urged his dragon to be careful with this creature. Then a fox approached the guy and said that she understood the language of the lizards, where whatever has now possessed Todd really wants to deal with Nigel himself for his defeat in another world. And this monster, controlling the man's body, really only talked about tearing everyone apart. Realizing that one of the tournament participants had completely lost control of himself, the hosts panicked, calling for someone to stop the actions of this madman. Stan was also shocked by the actions of his subordinate, and he also urged the man to come to his senses and stop this madness. But in Todd's body, it was not Todd at all, where this monster that had settled there was already beginning a new attack on its opponent. Moreover, his blow was aimed directly at Nigel, who was standing nearby, and he had no time to react. At the same time as the fat man moved, the armored dragon, also located nearby, began to move. Not knowing how to save himself, the young man tried to appeal to the common sense of the big guy rushing towards him. At the very last moment, an armored dragon appeared in the line of the axe's strike and took on all this power. Nigel didn't even have time to say anything, helplessly watching as his warrior's armor split and crumbled. The guy immediately rushed forward to stop the fall of his brave defender. Bleeding profusely, the fallen defender continued to talk about how he needed to protect his master, but the young man told him not to speak and to save his remaining strength. At this point, Nigel's attention was drawn to Roxanne, who shouted that Todd was ready to strike again. Turning quickly, the young man saw in front of him a crazy big guy who had already managed to swing his bulky axe. But then the god of greed came into play and began to spread his purple mist. Using his magic, he began to remove the possession from Todd, returning the creature he had once absorbed to a special vessel. At that very second, the man stopped his actions, dropped his weapon, and froze in place. Along with the departure of the lizard from his body, traces of physiological changes began to dissolve. A few seconds later, the man's massive body collapsed to the floor, and the commentators noted a gross violation of the rules, due to which one of the members of the opposing team was injured. After which both the man and the girl agreed that the last two fights had brought many surprises, and would be remembered by everyone for a long time. Well, the self-satisfied god of greed noted that he had just saved Nigel again, who, in payment of his debt, could give him his dying red lizard. But in response, he received only a bunch of angry words from both the guy himself and Regina, where both stated that he would never get an armored dragon. Only now did the young man notice that the dragon in his arms was engulfed in flames. Nigel jumped up as quickly as he could and stepped aside, trying to extinguish his burning palm. After which he watched in amazement as this incredible creature underwent yet another transformation. Well, when the flame went out, none of those present could utter a single word, watching before them the one who came out of the fire. Commentators who first noted that this competitor had just completely healed himself, then pointed out that this fighter's appearance did not match the photo on the participating team's card. Nigel was amazed, and Regina explained that initially she only achieved an imitation of the human form in the lizard, but now she herself has evolved and turned into a human. The girl herself, who was in front of so many people for the first time in human form and without armor, began to feel very embarrassed. When she hid behind Nigel, he assumed that she was still afraid of Todd. But Regina, again noting the boy's low intelligence, said that she was most likely just shy, and the girl confirmed this, saying that she felt extremely awkward without a mask and with a human face. At this point, the god of greed intervened in the conversation, literally demanding that the guy hand over this phenomenal lizard to him as payment for saving his life. But the little goddess advised the boy not to listen to the cries of this lunatic who was obliged to save the man, because if he died from his actions, then the heavens themselves would punish the toad. The girl then added that killing people is strictly forbidden for God, so the god of greed should also thank the dragon for weakening Todd. Understanding the truth that was in Regina's words, the god of greed declared that the next fight would definitely be the end for the guy. He was about to add something else and offer a deal, but then the commentators announced that after a long meeting, it was decided that there had been a significant violation of the tournament rules on Todd's part. And then they added that because of this, Todd's entire team was disqualified, and the Fox's team would move on. After hearing this announcement, the young man could hardly believe that they had managed not only to survive these difficult battles, but also to survive. While everyone was trying to wrap their heads around what had happened, the commentators ended up saying there were no casualties on either side. The god of greed could not believe that his team and he personally were once again on the losing side. Nigel, in a satisfied voice, announced that they had managed to bypass and defeat an entire god. His joyful mood was cut short by Stan, who said that the guy was celebrating too early, where he already knew that the guy's cards had a usage limit, which meant that he could be killed at the right moment. Nigel chuckled and replied that he always had a couple of cards in reserve for Stan that he was very eager to use on him. At this point, the confrontation between the two teams was over, and to the sound of the commentators inviting the next two teams, Nigel and his mutated girls headed away from the arena. As he walked, the young man thought about how Stan had managed to find out that his cards were limited, and that there were none left by the time of the possible fight. Stan himself thought that he was lucky not to run into the guy in the arena, given that he still had cards left. And both of them thanked fate itself for the fact that they were lucky enough to avoid the fight and just move on with their lives. While everyone was leaving and new participants were preparing for the fight, commentators recommended that the victims seek medical attention. Hank, who had been watching the events all this time, could not help but notice that this dark-skinned girl, apparently, also possessed some kind of powerful artifact. But he was very surprised when he noticed how his companion only laughed at everything that was happening. In response to his question, she explained that people very thoughtlessly use their abilities right in front of everyone. When the girl calmed down a little, the man noted that the presence of an unidentified owner of the artifact was confirmed, and therefore they should start acting. But Gina refused, saying that their main task was to continue to monitor Nigel. The girl then turned her attention to the girl leaving the arena, accompanied by two men, where this girl acted as if these two were in her service. As he continued to move, the god of greed could not calm down, continuing to shout out one curse after another. He could not come to terms with the fact that in such a short time he had managed to lose twice to some person. Taking advantage of the situation, Stan noted that their participation in the tournament was over, which meant that he and Todd could be free. But this only provoked a new fit of rage from their master, who literally began to beat the men, accusing them of being useless. At some point, the Toad calmed down and grabbed the man by his tie. Revealing his true nature, the god of greed reminded Stan that their agreement was valid until the moment of revenge on Nigel, from whom it was necessary to take the deck of fate. At this moment, a man who appeared nearby approached the participants of the events, asking them who they were and whether they knew Nigel. Having rudely declared that the name of this impudent person should not be mentioned in his presence, the god of greed demanded that the uninvited guest leave, and Nate didn't understand at all what he had done to deserve such rude treatment towards him. But a second later he said that the girl should give him the artifact as quickly as possible, because a deal with a god could end badly for her. What was said interested the Toad, who immediately realized that the person in front of her was not quite an ordinary person. Without any sudden movements, the god of greed let go of Stan's tie, and a moment later, he ran with all his might away from this place, which had become dangerous for him. Neither Stan nor Todd could understand his call to get away from here as quickly as possible, but from the girl's face, drenched in sweat, one could immediately understand that the god who controlled this body was very scared. Nate, who was also accompanied by a goddess, noted that taking possession of a person's body is a great sin, where the verdict of his guilt in merging the two worlds was immediately passed by the goddess. The god of greed was making a last effort to hide, but his punisher was already spreading her energy. Already feeling how these dark rays touched the body that had been appropriated by them, the Toad quickly said that it had done wrong. The god of greed demanded that he not be touched, promising to return this body voluntarily. At the same time, the hosts congratulated the Fox team on reaching the semi-finals, where now they only had to wait for the start of a new test. Matt, who had been watching the battle all this time, did not understand where his worthless friend had managed to find such strong allies. Betty did not hide her joy that the team with Nigel was able to move on, and suddenly the man standing behind Matt with a bottle declared that he wanted to let this team win the next battle. Such a statement could not fail to attract the attention of a young man who was determined only to win. And when he asked why they would throw the fight, the group's leader, Lewis, stated that he made this decision after seeing the performance of the Fox team. And when Betty pointed out that the next test was about to begin while the man was drunk, he smugly declared that alcohol would not prevent him from demonstrating strength. Meanwhile, Matt, jumping up from his seat, declared that he did not agree to lose, especially to such a weakling as Nigel. And when he once again asked about the reasons why the leader decided to throw the fight, Lewis explained that it was connected with the girls from Nigel's team. This statement from the leader literally stunned both members of his team, and he was already describing each of the beautiful girls who made his whole body covered in goosebumps. And his plan was to give the victory to Nigel in exchange for the contacts of these beauties. Listening to his leader, Matt noted that by his age he should have already had a life partner, but Betty stated that he did not have one due to Lewis's lack of brains. Well, the leader in love continued to insist on his own, saying that he would also be ready to take Nigel into his team if he allowed him to meet these girls. After thinking for a bit, the quick-witted Betty decided to intervene in the situation. Turning to Lewis, she asked him to think about what kind of impression he could make on the girls if he simply lost the fight to them. However, the man immediately remembered how he once won a fight, where the girl he liked threw herself into the arms of the defeated man. But his teammates recalled that this result was not due to the victory, but because the leader had already managed to make a bad impression on her before the match. Taking advantage of the man's confusion, Betty said that this time he had a chance to arrange events differently. She also drew the man's attention to the reasons why both girls agreed to join such a weakling's team, hinting that he was very handsome. As she spoke, Matt began to wonder if she was going too far. In concluding her speech, Betty noted that Nigel was most likely misleading these girls about his capabilities, and Matt, standing next to her, only supported everything that was said. And Betty's words had an effect, where Lewis, intoxicated with love, began to come to the conclusion that he had almost given the victory to some worthless person. And a moment later, the man was already in a state of rage, loudly declaring that he would teach a lesson to the impudent fellow who was deceiving such glorious beauties. And while he was cursing Nigel, Matt reminded the girl that the one she had set the leader on was actually their childhood friend. Nigel and his accompanying Fox heard Lewis say that he would personally deal with the guy, as well as his request to Matt to be gentler with the girls during the fight. After this, Roxana noted that the young man's popularity knows no bounds, and that even other teams are talking about him. The girl suggested coming up and greeting his future opponents, but the young man decided not to do so. As he walked away, he did nothing but smirk, calling Lewis's team a bunch of lunatics. With his hands in his pockets, the man moved down the corridor in search of his comrade. At some point, his attention was drawn to some movement ahead, accompanied by loud screams. It was Todd and his boss Stanley, running as fast as they could away from the dangerous place. Hank immediately recognized the two who accompanied the dark-skinned girl into the arena against the Fox's team. After watching the fugitives go, the man turned his attention to the one who remained in place. It was Nate, clutching an object in his hand that Hank mistook for the artifact taken from the black girl. Then he noticed that the girl herself was alive, but for some unknown reason he could not feel her soul. The doll in his hand continued to emit purple smoke, looking at which Hank hoped that at least it would not explode, and Nate explained that he was unable to completely break the connection. But at some point, a voice began to be heard from the doll in the young man's hand, and this voice was already quite loudly demanding that he be released immediately. Amazed, Hank and Nate listened attentively to the words of the unknown creature about how he could still be useful to everyone. Not expecting the doll to talk, Nate dropped the scary thing, which Hank didn't even try to catch, and then the doll fell, hitting right on the head of the girl lying unconscious on the floor. And the god of greed joyfully declared that he had regained control over this body. When the girl rose to her feet, he, with her help, declared that even another, more powerful goddess could not completely isolate him. Stretching his arms forward, the toad declared that now that he had his body back, he was no longer afraid of anything, and that those who had touched him would now experience the wrath of God. But he did not see any fear in the eyes of his opponents, where the goddess who had appeared noted that now he would experience her wrath for the fact that she had to work overtime. The god of greed had no choice but to fall to his knees and beg for mercy, explaining his behavior by the fact that he was too happy about the return of the body. Then Nate asked him to explain who he was, saying that the goddess accompanying him was stingy with explanations, but only gave him strength. The god of greed was very surprised to hear such a statement. Without waiting for an answer, the young man suggested that the entity release this body, and then there would be no questions for him. But he decided that the toad was threatening him when the boy heard the argument that the girl would die if the god left her body. And then the god of greed told that this girl was also a hunter and often acted as bait, but their team faced an opponent that they were unable to defeat. A badly wounded and dying girl found his statue and began to pray for salvation. In exchange for saving her, she made a deal with him, according to which he could use her body, and would return it when she was out of danger. Under such circumstances, no one has the right to interfere with transactions concluded voluntarily, and if the separation is forced, this girl will die. Finishing with his explanations, the god of greed noted that although he mostly didn't care, he would definitely feel uneasy if the girl died. While Hank and Nate were discussing what to do next, the toad quietly turned around and tried to hide. Noticing this attempt, the young man advised the detainee not to do anything stupid. But he didn't even think of stopping, promising never to catch the eye of men again. But suddenly his progress was stopped by someone's hand grabbing the doll. It was Gina who asked her new acquaintance not to rush to leave, since they had just met. After all, she had quite a large number of questions for the god of greed. It was time for the semi-final challenges, where the commentators announced that the rules for the semi-finals would be different. All participants will be thrown into another world, where their confrontation will take place. In the semi-finals, all team members will be able to compete at the same time, which should show how well they can work together. Each participant also had special crystals. To win, you need to inflict heavy damage on the enemy, or take away and break the crystal. You can also self-destruct by breaking your crystal. The two remaining teams will advance to the finals, regardless of how many of its members were able to survive. All 4 teams that reached this level took part in the semi-finals. Then the players were introduced, with Lewis's team being the first. Next on the list was a team that positioned themselves as Saints, led by a girl named Miranda. The third to reach the final was the team led by the big guy Harold. And closing the list of semi-finalists was the team of the beautiful fox Roxana, whose leader for some reason was called Nigel. Spectators will be able to observe the events taking place thanks to flying cameras launched into that world. The young man was very pleased with the rules for participation in the semi-finals, where he had the opportunity to prove himself. A monster of incredible size slowly moved among the trees of the world, in which the semi-final test of the tournament participants was taking place. Nate watched every step of this giant closely from his simple hiding place in the bushes. While the boy was wondering why there was a sky and such monsters in this world, his red dragon noted that they could not defeat this monster. Regina gave some explanations, saying that this is not a completely different world, but something like a border between Earth and other worlds. After all, you can get to other worlds only by distorting the space and matter that are nearby. This place had strict boundaries, but no one could go beyond them. And when the young man noted that they definitely wouldn't be able to defeat this dinosaur-like creature, the commentators, using the camera, urged him not to worry, since this creature wasn't very aggressive. Moreover, This dominant monster here almost never attacks people, which Nigel found hard to believe. And the girl commentator reminded that even in the case of receiving critical damage, the crystal will activate its action, which will instantly return the guy back to the arena. This made Nigel wonder why such crystals were not used in cleansing, to which Regina explained, noting that these crystals were bound and only worked here. Having received answers to all the questions, the young man noticed that their fox friend still had not returned. Roxanne didn't understand how this was possible when her body was pierced in several places at once, but having moved into one of the hiding clones, the girl managed to notice how an archer was working on her. She herself went to look for the enemy, but it turned out that the enemy found her first. She was already able to appreciate the considerable strength of this participant who used energy arrows. But the fox's abilities were also very strong, and logical thinking led her to the idea that a sniper should always be covered by someone. Therefore, it was all a well-organized trap. Roxanne realized that the lone archer who never left his position was nothing more than bait, but she could not sense the presence of anyone else. Meanwhile, the guy above the fox informed his partner that he was now neutralizing the enemy, where no one can sense his presence while he uses his skills. The archer urged his partner to be careful, but he had already ducked down, thinking that he would be the first to open the scoring in the semi-final. Of course, the fox noticed the danger, but the enemy, who had quickly descended, managed to strike. And although the guy was able to feel how his hand touched the fox, nevertheless, it turned out to be just an illusion. He couldn't believe that he, an experienced assassin, could be identified and noticed by some fox. Well, Roxanne herself, using her clones, had already begun counterattacking actions. And unlike her opponent, she managed to reach her intended target. After the first successful attack, the boy suddenly felt a furry paw grab his hand. Approaching the one who tried to attack her, Roxanne told the little assassin to stay away from her. After which the girl threw her opponent away from herself. Continuing to warm up her fists, the fox noted that, apparently, her opponent's main skill was secret stalking. But then her opponent said that he was not a girl, but a guy, after which he asked how she was able to find him. And Roxana explained that thanks to her wonderful ears, she can hear about 100 times better than an ordinary person, and therefore she heard all his negotiations with the archer perfectly. When the assassin informed his partner that they had been exposed, the latter suggested that he lure the fox under his arrows. Well, the fox herself, while her opponents were communicating, suddenly began to sniff, sensing something new. And finally, the girl realized that her opponent had some very unusual smell. When he frantically began to explain that he was thinking before the competition, and the smell was probably due to the fact that he had stepped on something, Roxanne added that it was more like medication than what he was thinking. The fox hearing archer noted that it was most likely the enhancing drug their leader had given them. Roxanne reacted to this immediately, chuckling at the use of such a remedy. Turning away, the assassin began to demand that the archer no longer speak to him, because their opponent had heard literally everything. After which he took up a fighting stance, deciding to fight the fox openly since his sneak attack had completely failed. The girl immediately identified a martial arts master in front of her who could change his abilities using mana, after which the girl stated that she would give the opponent a chance to try to hit her at least once. And as soon as she finished speaking, the young man quickly jumped up from his seat and rushed into the attack. The blow was delivered, but in front of him there was only a clone, which instantly dissolved into thin air. Then the assassin continued the attack, but just like the first time, another fox double appeared in front of him. Roxana herself really enjoyed literally leading her opponent by the nose, and so the young man was literally surrounded by copies of the fox, each of which, as always, acted independently and autonomously. Well, the real fox, as usual, had already managed to get close to the guy from behind. She practically sat on his neck, saying that she had finally got him. But Roxanne didn't have time to inflict any significant damage on him, as the guy was able to intercept her striking rap. He chuckled contentedly, and noted that he had been waiting for this very moment throughout the entire confrontation with the clones, after which the girl felt her opponent pull her forward with a sharp movement. The girl only had time to ask what he was planning to do with her, but after a moment she felt her body in free flight. As it turned out, the assassin threw the enemy straight into the direct line of fire of his partner, who was already preparing to shoot. One after another, the archer began to fire his energy arrows at the fox. The girl was able to see them flying towards her while she was still in the air. She understood perfectly well that at this particular moment, she did not have the opportunity to use the movement into one of her clones, and therefore she had no choice but to try to avoid this attack, which was dangerous for her further participation. But the maneuver was successful, with the help of which, even having lost another clone, the transfer to which had already become possible, she managed to avoid returning to the arena. The little fox noticed with annoyance that one of her favorite jackets had been damaged. But that was not all. because then she also discovered that one of the arrows had managed to catch her precious lush tail. And while she was lamenting about her tail, the assassin declared that he now knew how to deal with the fox clones. The upset girl didn't even immediately understand what he was trying to talk to her about. And the guy said that, according to his assumption, the fox moves itself into a safe clone. But when it attacks, it cannot use movement for some time. Therefore, there is no point in him attacking the fox when he can instead simply wait for it to initiate the attack itself. But then Roxanne asked what he would do if she herself did not start attacking. Moreover, Roxanne noted that she was not so stupid as to fall for the same trick every time. The girl also did not forget to mention that she would not forgive her opponents for what they did to her tail. To the archer's question, the assassin replied that he would try to catch this cunning opponent again. But at some point, the leader of this group contacted her team and asked how things were going. The girl herself stated that everything was ready to drive the harmful fox into a trap from which she would not be able to escape. After which, having mixed some potions, Miranda threw the flasks with them right at her feet, spreading the effect of the resulting substance. With this, she created a section of terrain where neither magic nor any skills worked. The essence of the plan was to wait until one of the opponents was in this zone, which would make it easy to neutralize him. At some point, Roxanne's keen sense of smell caught a new scent of some kind of potion. At first, she thought that her opponent had used some kind of poison in order to win, but soon enough the girl realized that it was something else. And then the assassin who confronted her said that the fox had just found herself in a place where she could not use her abilities, including her signature skill of creating clones, which is how she manages to survive. But Roxana only laughed, wondering if such preparations had been made just for her sake. But her opponent and interlocutor explained that all this was not invented only to deal with the fox. Of course, the fox has its own unique skill that is difficult to compete with. But the girl ended up in their trap by pure chance. The girl was even a little upset by the fact that such preparations were not intended only for her. Well, the assassin, pleased with himself and his team, said that only 2 teams could reach the final, where such a trap is a very big advantage and a bid for victory. Where, under such circumstances, they won't even have to do anything, but can simply wait until the end of the semi-finals. Both the archer and Miranda tried to stop him as he continued to lay out their entire strategy. Suddenly the young man fell silent, seeing how the fox at some point began to throw off its outer clothing. Looking at the beautiful fox girl, the guy blushed and wondered why she started to undress. And now he was literally hiding his gaze, asking the girl why she had unbuttoned the buttons in the chest area. His partner heard all this, whose face was literally burning with tension, where he would very much like to see what his companion refused to look at. The little fox explained that she didn't undress to show off her charms to the guy, but only because her breasts were getting bigger and the button could come off. Words about breast augmentation could not leave young people indifferent, and they no longer knew what to do with themselves. The leader of the group managed to bring the assassin to his senses a little by shouting that the fox was simply stalling for time for something that needed to be stopped immediately. But then Roxana menacingly declared that the time for any action had long been lost. Standing on the edge of some fog, Nigel tried to understand from the sounds what was happening there. Regina explained that this was a special border formed by a magic potion, and the young man noticed that the fox went in that direction. After which the goddess noted that in the area of effect of this fog, the foxes would not be able to use their clones. This was not the best news, because the team could lose a strong member who needed to be urgently saved. Having called the guy to calm down, Regina began to study the effects of this magic, and so she stated that Nigel would not be able to use acceleration, slow down, and other cards, but he could use his dragon. And she added that soon all the teams will gather in this place, noticing the movement of the fog. As he was about to suggest something, the young man didn't notice a huge boulder flying straight at his head, who literally demolished him right before the armored dragon's eyes. As it turned out, the cobblestone was thrown by the team leader, Harold, who cheerfully declared that he was lucky to hit the leader of the other group. Delighted by this news, the other members of Harold's group immediately rushed forward, intending to finish what they had started and eliminate their rivals. The leader of the national team himself did not even have time to understand how a blazing enemy appeared next to him, which dealt the man an incredibly powerful blow, spreading the effect of its flame to him. At the same second, it was announced that the damage received had exceeded the permissible limit, and therefore the participant was moved to the arena. One of the team members couldn't believe that their leader could be killed with just one blow. Well, the flaming armored dragon declared that it was unforgivable for anyone to touch her master. The girl believed that Nigel had already dropped out of this confrontation, and therefore intended to take merciless revenge. Watching their blazing opponent, the team members did not know what to do, because this man neutralized the leader himself in literally a second. But the demonic character was the first to suggest trying to launch a joint attack and try to defeat the enemy. However, His plan was not destined to come to fruition, as the armored dragon was faster and was already striking the second opponent. After which it was announced that the damage limit had been exceeded, and that another participant was returning to the arena. The only surviving member of the team could not believe that they had been completely destroyed by just 2 blows from one man. Well, the red dragon has already switched its attention to its last opponent. Knowing what was coming, he tried to block the possible damage that would take him out of the battle and the tournament. He managed to do this, and at the same time some sounds began to come from under the cobblestone. Regina was the first to express her surprise, not expecting to hear Nigel's voice. The girl was also surprised that after such a strong blow, the guy did not receive damage that would have returned him to the arena. And then she noticed in the young man's hand a card that activates stone armor. Then she noted that if all this had happened in another world, Nigel would have simply died already. But she nevertheless responded to the guy's request to help him get out from under this stone. As Nigel sat up, glad to have survived, Regina said that it would be better for him to lie under a rock until the battle was over. And then she advised the young man to be more careful next time, so as not to say goodbye to life in a real situation. But Nigel was now thinking that throwing such stones was not at all manly. Meanwhile, the confrontation between the armored dragon and the last remaining opponent of one of the teams. Watching the confrontation, the young man noticed that the guy fighting the dragon must have other members of the group somewhere nearby. But Regina calmed him down, saying that while he was lying under the stone, the dragon had managed to deal with the other 2. Amazed at how strong his dragon had become, the young man shouted that he was completely fine, after which he wished her a speedy victory over the last member of the enemy team. Hearing the voice of the owner, the girl stopped her movement, turned and directed her astonished gaze at Nigel. This delay was enough for her opponent to strike. For this purpose he used twin blades, with which he made a chopping motion. After which the girl's tight suit once again shattered into small pieces. Watching this, Regina declared that it would have been better if the guy had really remained lying under the stone. Well, Nigel himself, who was staring at the girl, was worried about a slightly different question, where after a fairly powerful attack she did not receive any damage, but only lost her armor. The situation was clarified by the dragon's opponent, who said that his attack was only capable of penetrating 1 level of defense, but the next blow would be his opponent's last in this tournament. After this, the young man said that he really liked the one he fought with, and therefore he invited her to join his team. Nigel responded to this proposal by recommending that the guy leave peacefully before he was returned to the arena by force. Well, his dragon, just like last time, began to get very embarrassed, hiding behind her owner's back. But suddenly the opponent stated that he had not set himself the goal of winning this tournament. The goal was to give newcomers the opportunity to show themselves, to demonstrate their strength, to get more commission. Victory might be an added bonus for them, but the real goal was to find worthy recruits. And when Nigel asked why he was interested in his dragon, the guy explained that it was because of her horns. After all, he sees perfectly well that this girl is half demon, just like himself. But neither Nigel nor the dragon, who continued to hide behind him, could understand what he was talking about. He puzzled his interlocutor by saying that his warrior's dragon horns had nothing to do with demons. The red half-demon's question about what he meant made the young man exhale heavily. And then he explained in more detail that this girl does not suffer from hunter syndrome, but is an evolved lizard. After these words, a long pause hung between the interlocutors. But the expression on the red half-demon's face suddenly began to change dramatically, and it was clear that he was having a hard time restraining himself. And when patience came to an end, the guy with horns laughed out loud, which surprised Nigel and the girl quite a bit. He didn't believe that in front of him stood an evolved lizard, and not a hunter with the syndrome. Nigel didn't know how else to explain to this guy that his dragon wasn't a half-demon, and the girl herself had spoken rather unflatteringly about the mental abilities of the master's interlocutor. Meanwhile, the young man with horns noticed that the fusion of human and monster essences occurs during cleansing, where his current appearance is due to the fact that he once slew a demon in another world. Nigel already knew all this, but he didn't understand why the guy was telling all this, and what it could have to do with them. Then the young man added that he destroyed that demon with his skills, and alone. He then turned his attention to the girl standing next to Nigel, where he expressed his very deep doubts that she could slay the dragon alone. Nigel then pointed out that he could not possibly know what they might be capable of, and what they might not be capable of. However, the guy insisted on his arguments, saying that this was where the key to the solution lay. After all, at present, there are only 4 officially known cases in which hunters were able to kill dragons. At some point, Regina intervened in this verbal altercation, noting that everyone here had forgotten the difference between a real dragon and a creature that was simply called a dragon. After all, the armored dragon is simply an evolved lizard, and not a man who absorbed part of the soul of the real dragon he defeated. Of course, the red half-demon didn't hear all of this, but nevertheless, he had already decided to change the subject. Activating his abilities, the young man noted that his interlocutors had two options: either join his team now or after he defeated them. After all, now the time has come to show them all my true demonic power. However, the attention of his opponents was clearly directed somewhere higher, where they recommended that the red half-demon himself look. But he didn't hear them, saying that now his strength had increased several times, and therefore he was very interested to see how long the guy's dragon could hold out against him. Then Nigel literally started shouting for his interlocutor and opponent to finally look up. The guy with the horns grinned and looked up, noting that it was an old trick that wouldn't work on him. But as it turned out, his opponents were not lying, as there was a huge paw right above his head. Seeing the huge monster, Nigel and his companion hastened to retreat. The young man could not understand why the monster that ruled here just fell out of the sky. Well, the red half-demon didn't have time to move aside and receive damage that was incompatible with the possibility of further participation in the tournament. In an instant, he was transported to where two other members of his team had gone a little earlier. Turning his attention to the screen, the young man noted with annoyance that their team had become the first to be eliminated from the semi-finals in its entirety, and his comrades noted that under such circumstances it would become much more difficult for them to attract new members. But then the red half-demon noticed some movement on the left side, where just now, two members of the group of saints were returned to the arena, annoyed that they had underestimated the fox. Assassin couldn't believe that she was able to defeat them even without using her clones, but only using her normal physical strength and agility. At some point, the guy felt someone's hand on his shoulder, and then heard an encouraging speech about how he was doing well, but just not fully ready. The red half-demon, noting his good abilities, invited the assassin to join his team, to which he immediately received a negative answer, with an explanation that he did not want to be the first to fly out of the tournament next time, as the inviting team. Meanwhile, Lewis was moving calmly through the expanses of the intermediate world, continuing to drink and hum some songs. The monster that was in charge here also ran through the forest, towering above the trees as if through tall grass, the movement of which could not go unnoticed by the fox, who not long ago managed to defeat two of her opponents. The girl noted that in this competition all teams behave quite aggressively, aiming for victory. And before continuing, she decided to find Nigel and the dragon, so as not to end up in a trap again. But suddenly she heard a voice behind her, suggesting that Roxanne have a little fun, since she didn't want to fall into a trap. Turning around, the fox advised the girl, who appeared to simply climb into the bushes and watch the other teams fight. But she, clutching a couple of flasks in her hand, said that she was simply very interested in finding out how the fox was able to defeat her comrades alone and without skills. To this, Roxana noted that her interlocutor was excessively curious, and when the fox said that the chemistry class would hardly help her, Miranda said that she actually has a high hunter level. Of course, Roxanne noticed the flasks in her opponent's hand, but it was unclear what she was going to do with them. Deciding not to wait, but to act first, the fox made a swift dash forward and upward, where, with one deft blow, she destroyed both flasks that the girl had prepared in advance. But Roxanne has not yet been able to get Miranda herself. However, a moment later, the fox suddenly felt the strong smell that began to spread after she destroyed the flasks, and her opponent noted with satisfaction that the fox had fallen for the bait she had prepared. And suddenly the girl began to move very quickly to the side, saying that this was all she needed. Believing that success would be assured, Miranda attempted to strike her opponent, but to her great surprise, the blow landed straight on one of the illusions created by the fox. This was extremely surprising for Miranda, who immediately remembered everything that her comrades, the assassin and the archer, had talked about. The girl didn't even have time to realize how Roxanne appeared behind her and hugged her around the waist. This gesture seemed strange to the girl, provoking a question about what the fox had in mind. Roxana replied that this was definitely not a sign of love and attention, lifting her rival into the air. She then forcefully lowered Miranda to the ground using a backbend. She then noted that she was strong enough to continue the fight, and the potion Miranda had used certainly had no effect on her. But the girl lying on the ground said that this potion should not have had any effect on the fox. Interrupting her interlocutor, Roxanne said that she did not want to discuss it, and suggested simply ending Miranda's participation in the tournament. She agreed to leave the tournament, but only after she saw the fox's performance in entertaining the guests. Where after these words, a variety of monsters that live here began to appear from the thickets. Glancing sideways at these guests, the girl immediately realized that there was definitely something wrong with these animals. Miranda, meanwhile, managed to get to her feet, noticing that her potion was beginning to work. After all, what the fox broke was a special stimulant that attracts all the local monsters, and so now everything that lives here will haunt Roxana, on whose paw the aroma of the potion remains. Watching the monsters approach, The little fox noted that this would be quite troublesome for her. Clutching his weapon tightly in his hand, Matt was glad that he was finally able to find his friend. Turning around, Nigel was very surprised that the young man had come to him all alone, and not as part of a team. The young man also noticed that his friend looked very out of breath, but he urged the guy not to worry about this, explaining his condition by minor disagreements with his teammates. And when Matt was able to catch his breath enough to speak normally, he immediately recommended that Nigel find shelter for himself as quickly as possible.